The sound came first. Hooves. Hundreds of them. Moving in a slow, deliberate circle that made the desert floor hum against his ribs like something alive beneath the earth. His eyes snapped open in the dark. His hand found the rifle, before his mind even knew what it was reaching for. Through the gap in the shutters, gray light bled into the sky. Not sunrise. Just the warning of it. He crossed to the window, looked out, and stopped breathing. Warriors. 3 perfect rings around his cabin. He started counting the way he used to count cattle. Slow. Steady. 20. 40. 60. He stopped somewhere past 400. 400 painted faces. 400 drawn bows. Feathers stirring on lances in a wind he could not feel. At the center of the formation sat a woman on a painted horse, still as stone between 2 warriors built like the mountains behind them. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. This was not a raid. Raids were fast. Loud. Gone before the dust settled. This had rhythm. This had been planned. This felt like judgment. The sound came first. Before thought. Before fear. Hooves. Hundreds of them. Moving in a slow, deliberate circle that made the desert floor hum against Jonah Ward's ribs like something alive underneath the earth. His eyes snapped open in the dark. And his hand found the rifle, before his mind caught up. Before he even knew what he was reaching for. 12 years of sleeping alone in Apache country had taught his body that lesson. Wake fast. Or don't wake at all. Through the gap in the shutters, gray light was bleeding into the sky. Not sunrise yet. Just the warning of it. June 1892, and already the air tasted like the furnace this day was going to become. But heat wasn't what turned Jonah's blood to ice water. He crossed to the window, looked out, and stopped breathing. Warriors. Circling his cabin in 3 rings, tight and perfect, like something drawn with a compass. He started counting the way he used to count cattle. Slow. Steady. Forcing the panic down into his boots, where it couldn't reach his hands. 20. 40. 60. He stopped somewhere past 400. 400 painted faces. 400 drawn bows. And one 40-year-old widower, who hadn't spoken to another living soul in longer than he wanted to admit, standing in a 16 by 20 adobe box, with 18 inches of wall between him and every single one of them. This wasn't a raid. Raids were fast. Loud. In and gone before the dust settled. This was something else. Something with a rhythm to it. Something that had been planned. This was judgment. The riders sat motionless on their horses. War paint fresh. Red ochre streaked across cheekbones like something torn open. Some carried bows, with arrows already nocked, strings drawn halfway, patient as held breath. Others carried lances. And on a few of those lances, feathers moved slightly in wind Jonah couldn't feel, from inside his own walls. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. Stop that, he told himself. Stop it right now. Except they didn't stop. Because his hands had never once lied to him about how afraid he really was, even when the rest of him tried to. He grabbed the Winchester. 28 rounds in the box by the bed. Against 400 men, the math wasn't complicated. It was just cruel. Even if every shot landed true. Even if he were the finest marksman in the territory, which he wasn't, not anymore, not since his hands started doing this thing they were doing now. He'd be dead before he emptied the rifle twice. So the rifle wasn't going to save him. Which meant something else was going to have to. His eyes kept drifting back to the center of the formation. To a woman seated on a painted horse between 2 warriors built like the mountains behind them. And Jonah knew her. Not her name. He didn't have that yet. But he knew her face. Because he'd seen it yesterday afternoon, kneeling in the dirt beside a broken travois, with her hands working at a shattered crossbeam like she believed sheer wood could mend split wood. He should have kept riding. That's what men did out here. Kept their heads down. Minded their own dirt. Arizona Territory wasn't a place that rewarded good Samaritans. Kindness got men killed out here just as often as cruelty did. But something about the way she'd worked. Alone. Silent. Determined in the middle of nowhere. Had made him pull his horse to a stop. Maybe it was Eleanor. The memory of her, still sharp enough to cut, after 12 years, still showing up uninvited at the worst possible moments. Or maybe it was something uglier. Something he didn't like looking at directly. A debt he never paid off, from a summer 12 years back, that he tried very hard never to think about. Or maybe, and this was the one that scared him most, maybe it was just loneliness. 12 years of it, so deep and so total that even a stranger's silence felt like water in a desert. Whatever it was. He'd stopped. He'd dismounted without a word. Boots crunching against cracked earth. Walked over to look at the damage. The crossbeam had split clean through. Probably a rock. Or a gopher hole. Without it, the frame was useless. Couldn't carry whatever she'd been hauling behind that horse. She'd looked up at him. And her eyes had stopped him cold. Dark. Unreadable. Measuring him the way you'd measure a tool, before you trusted it, with something important. She wore a buckskin dress worked through with chunks of turquoise that caught the afternoon light like pieces of stolen sky. Enough turquoise, Jonah had thought at the time, to be worth a month's wages back in Wilcox. That should have told him something. It didn't. He gestured to the travois. A silent offer. She'd studied him a moment longer. Then stepped back. Gave him room to work. He pulled a spare length of ironwood from his saddlebag. Dense. Strong. The desert's answer to oak. Used rawhide strips to bind it, wet, so it would shrink tight, as it dried in the sun. His father's trick, learned back in Tennessee, that didn't exist anymore, before the war took it apart piece by piece. 18 minutes. He timed it by the sun's crawl, an old farmer's habit, that never quite left him. She watched every motion. Not with gratitude. With something closer to study. Like she was memorizing each knot. Each cut. Each choice he made, and why he made it. It unsettled him. Though he couldn't have said why. When he finished, she tested the repair. Rolled it back and forth. Checked it the way someone checks equipment their life depends on. One nod. That was all he got. Then she climbed onto her horse and rode off, without looking back. 20 minutes total. Jonah had thought nothing more of it. Just another quiet moment folded into a long string of quiet moments that made up his entire small life. He'd ridden home. Unsaddled copper, his Appaloosa. Eaten cold beans and salt pork standing at the stove, because sitting down to eat alone at a table built for two had never stopped feeling wrong, not once, in 12 years. Cleaned the Winchester. Lit the lamp. Tried to read a farmer's almanac 3 years out of date, until his eyes gave out. And before sleep took him completely, he'd done what he always did. Walked the perimeter. Old habit. Left over from years, when Apache raids were common enough, that staying alert meant staying alive. That's when he found them. Hoofprints. Dozens. Unshod, the way Apache horses ran. Pressed deep into sand about 200 yards from where he'd fixed that travois. 12 horses. Maybe 15. They'd been watching. The whole time. Watching him. Watching her. Watching an 18-minute repair like it was something worth 4 days of patient surveillance. Jonah had stood there in the dark, heart picking up speed, understanding arriving slow and cold, the way understanding does when you don't want it. She hadn't been alone. She'd never been alone. The broken travois. The isolated spot. The timing. Staged. He'd loaded the rifle that night. Checked his knife. Placed everything within reach of the bed. If they came for him in the dark, he'd at least make it cost something. But the night passed in silence. The kind of quiet that presses harder than noise ever could. And now dawn had come. and so had 400 hooves. And Jonah finally understood. They hadn't been waiting for darkness. They'd been waiting for something else entirely. One of the warriors dismounted. He was enormous. 240 pounds wrapped in muscle, an old scar tissue, 3 red stripes cutting across his face in lines too precise to be anything but ceremony. Bare-chested despite the morning chill. A headdress of eagle feathers marking him as something more than just another rider. He walked forward. Owned the ground beneath every step. 20 paces from the door, he drove his lance into the earth. Hard enough that the shaft still trembled after he let go. Then he spoke. Formal. Rhythmic. Sharp as something read aloud in a courtroom Jonah had never entered. Jonah understood none of it. Not a challenge. Not a warning. Not an invitation. He had no context. No translator. No way to navigate whatever ritual was unfolding 20 feet from where he stood, with his hands shaking on a rifle that wouldn't save him. The warrior finished. Stepped back. Waited. Minutes crawled by. Sweat soaked through Jonah's shirt. The warriors didn't move. Didn't speak. Painted faces blank as stone. Weapons ready but not raised. Waiting for something. Waiting for him. But for what? Then the woman moved. A small gesture. Almost nothing. She raised her right hand, palm out, held it 3 heartbeats. Lowered it. And 10 warriors dismounted at once. They walked forward. Synchronized. Formed a half circle around the door. Bows raised. Not aimed at the door itself. Just held there, level, patient, a wall of muscle, an intention that didn't need to say what it meant. This was escalation. Whatever they were waiting for. His window to provide it was closing. Jonah looked at his choices. Stay inside and die slow, starved out or burned out. Or open the door and die fast, or maybe, not die at all. Neither option offered hope. One of them at least offered dignity. He set the rifle down. His hand shook around the door handle. Metal hot from a sun that hadn't fully risen yet. One breath. Then another. Through the gap in the wood, he could see the arrows. Steady. Held by hands that weren't going to tremble no matter what he said next. He opened the door. And stepped into the light. The sun hit him like something physical. He had to squint against it, standing there unarmed, exposed, 400 pairs of eyes fixed on him, with a weight that felt like it might actually crush his ribs. The 10 men with drawn bows didn't flinch. Arrows leveled at his chest. The huge warrior stepped closer. Up close he was even bigger than Jonah's first count had suggested. His eyes, underneath all that red paint, looked like chips of black glass. He spoke again. Slower this time. Each word deliberate. A question, Jonah guessed from the shape of it. And waited. I don't understand what you're saying, Jonah said. His voice came out rougher than he wanted. Nothing changed in the man's face. He turned. Gestured toward the woman. She dismounted. Walked forward. The warriors parted for her, without being told, like water finding its own channel. Up close, Jonah saw details he missed the day before. The beadwork on her vest, patterns that told a story he had no way of reading. Silver bands hammered flat around her wrists. And the way every man near her seemed to track her movement, with something between reverence and caution. She stopped beside the big warrior. Studied Jonah with the same unreadable eyes from yesterday. Then she spoke. And it was English. He asks if you knew who I was? When you stopped. The question hung there in the heat. Jonah's mind scrambled. This was a test. Wrong answer, and it might cost him everything. He had no idea what right looked like. So he gave her the only thing he had left. No, he said. I saw someone who needed help. She translated. The big man's jaw tightened. Some of the mounted riders shifted. Tension thickened like humidity, before a storm that hadn't broken yet. He asks why. Why help someone you don't know? Because it didn't matter who she was, Jonah said. A broken wheel is a broken wheel, she translated. And this time the reaction was sharper. The big man's eyes narrowed. He looked at the woman. Something passed between them Jonah couldn't read. Agreement. Or suspicion. Maybe both at once. The man spoke again. Longer. Harder. The woman turned back. And for the first time, Jonah saw something complicated cross her face. Not quite anger. Not forgiveness either. Something caught in between, like a door that hadn't decided which way it wanted to swing. I am Senna, she said. Her voice had gone formal now. Like she was reading from something written long before this morning. Daughter of Chief Takian. She gestured to the man beside her. This is my father. You touched what belongs to a chief's daughter. Without permission. This is a violation. It demands an answer. Jonah's stomach dropped somewhere below his boots. A chief's daughter. That explained the numbers. The ceremony. The careful, terrible protocol of it all. I meant no disrespect, he said. I didn't know. What you meant does not matter, Senna said. What you did. That is what matters. Takian spoke again. Demanding now. Insistent. Senna translated, and Jonah heard the trap closing around him, before she'd even finished the sentence. My father asks? If you had known who I was, would you have helped anyway? Another sneer. Say yes, and he was claiming he didn't care about their law. Say no, and his kindness had a price tag on it after all. The truth was all he had left. And it wasn't clean. I don't know, Jonah said, holding her eyes. I hope I would have. I can't say for certain. Something shifted in her face. Was that approval? He couldn't tell. She translated. Takian studied him a long moment. Like he was seeing something new. Something he hadn't expected to find standing in a doorway at dawn. Then the chief did something Jonah didn't understand yet. He drew a knife. Obsidian blade, catching the light like captured dark. Held it high, so every warrior present could see it. Then drove it into the ground between them, with enough force to make the dirt shudder. A ripple ran through the warriors. Some straightened. Others exchanged glances. Senna's face stayed neutral, but her shoulders tensed in a way that told Jonah something important had just happened. Something he was too far outside their world to read. She looked at him. And for the first time, he saw something close to concern behind her eyes. My father has decided, she said quietly. You will be tested. Pass, and you are honored. A man of true heart. Fail. She let the words sit there. And you answer with your life. Jonah's pulse hammered. What kind of test? Her eyes went to the knife. Standing upright in the dirt. Then back to him. The kind that proves whether yesterday was courage, she said, or foolishness. Two warriors brought forward a horse for him. Strong. Gray as storm clouds. They handed him the reins. No bridle. He would ride the way they did. Legs and balance. Nothing else. Another test before the tests had even started. Jonah mounted slow. Approached from the left. Kept his movements smooth, confident, the way he'd learned breaking horses back, when that was cheaper than buying them trained. Hand on the withers. Let the animal feel his weight settle. His breathing steady. The horse shifted under him once. Testing. Then held still. A few nods around the circle. Barely there. But real. Not approval, exactly. Not contempt either. He'd take it. Takian gave a sharp command. The whole formation shifted, warriors closing in on all sides, boxing Jonah so completely that escape wasn't even a fantasy worth entertaining. Senna rode at the front, beside her father. Back straight. Eyes forward. Giving nothing away. They moved as one. Hundreds of horses. A sound like distant thunder rolling across flat land. Dust rose behind them, and turned the sun hazy, coated the inside of Jonah's throat with grit. No one spoke. The silence felt intentional, heavy with judgment. Like every rider was using these hours to decide, privately, whether the man in their midst deserved what was coming, or whether mercy might somehow find its way into the arithmetic. Jonah's mind wouldn't stop turning. What kind of test? Physical, he could brace for. Pain, he understood the shape of. But tests of mind. Of heart. How do you prepare for something you can't see coming? And what did it mean, that no man his age, he'd overheard the phrase somewhere in the crowd's murmuring, half guessed at its meaning, had ever passed all three? He studied the riders around him. War paint made them look almost inhuman. Something out of the stories his mother used to tell back in a Tennessee winter, that felt like it belonged to somebody else's life now. But under the paint, they were just men. Some young enough that their faces still held a boy's uncertainty next to a man's ambition. Others carrying decades of scars that told stories Jonah couldn't read and had no right to ask about. All of them rode like the horse was an extension of their own spine. Jonah had grown up on a farm. Learned to ride because you had to. But watching these men, he understood there was a difference between someone who rode a horse and someone who lived inside the rhythm of one. The land changed as they traveled. Flat desert gave way to rising hills, twisted mesquite, rock formations jutting up like broken teeth against the sky. The air thinned. Grew harder to pull into his lungs. After nearly 2 hours, Senna dropped back from the front. Rode alongside him. Said nothing for a while, eyes scanning the horizon in that constant way people learn, when threats have taught them to watch. Then, low enough only he could hear. "You wonder why I was alone yesterday?" Not a question. Jonah nodded anyway. "I was being tested too," she said. "My father believes I am too soft. Too willing to trust outsiders. He sent me into the desert. Alone. To learn what trusting a stranger costs." She glanced at him. And Jonah saw something raw underneath the calm. Fear, maybe? Braided tight with something that looked almost like determination. "When you stopped," she said, "you proved his point." The weight of that landed on Jonah's shoulders like stones dropped into a sack, one at a time. "I made it worse for you." "Yes," she said simply. And he was grateful for the honesty even as it tightened something in his chest. "Now I must prove my judgment was not weak. If you fail these trials, I fail as well. My father will never let me speak in council again. I will be married for alliance. Forgotten." Jonah felt the weight multiply. This wasn't only about his own life anymore. "Why tell me this?" he asked. She met his eyes. Steady. Dark. "Because if you understand what is truly at stake," she said, "you will fight harder to survive. And I need you to survive." Before he could answer, a shout rose from the front of the column. The riders ahead had stopped. Between two towering rock walls, Jonah could see an opening. A natural gateway, carved by water and centuries, leading into a valley he couldn't see the bottom of yet. The stone rose at least 180 feet on either side. A corridor that felt less like an entrance, and more like a throat waiting to close around him. Takian raised a hand. The whole formation stopped. He turned in his saddle. Looked back at Jonah, with eyes that promised nothing but judgment. Eyes that had seen too many men fail this exact walk, and felt nothing when they did. Senna's voice dropped to barely more than breath. "We have arrived," she said. "Whatever happens next, do not show fear. They will read it as guilt." The column began moving again. Funneling through the narrow passage in small groups, the walls swallowing the sky above them 1 degree at a time. Jonah's horse followed. And with every step the temperature dropped, shadow pooling cold against skin still slick with sweat. His stomach knotted tighter with each hoofbeat. Because whatever waited on the other side of that stone corridor was going to decide everything. Not just for him. For her too. The valley opened like a wound cut straight into the earth. Steep walls on every side. A natural amphitheater that trapped both sound and heat in equal, merciless measure. At the center, a flat stretch of hard-packed dirt. Empty except for 3 wooden posts, driven deep, each one standing twice the height of a man. Even from a distance, Jonah could see the dark staining near the base of the center post. He didn't let himself finish the thought. Didn't need to. His mind supplied the answer whether he wanted it or not. Blood. Old. Soaked so deep into the wood it had become part of it. The warriors formed a wide circle. Horses shoulder to shoulder, a living wall around the arena. Jonah dismounted. Legs stiff. The air here felt heavier. Charged. Like every ceremony ever performed in this exact spot had left something behind, that hadn't finished settling. Sacred ground. And sacred ground had rules he didn't know. Takian walked to the center. Spoke, his voice bouncing off stone in a language Jonah couldn't follow, and the assembled warriors answered together, one word, something between acknowledgement and vow. Senna appeared at Jonah's side. Close enough he could hear her breathing, quick, shallow, despite the calm she kept nailed to her face. He tells them why we are here, she said quietly. That you touched what belonged to our family. That you will prove now whether your heart deserves forgiveness. Jonah studied her profile. The tension in her jaw. How many have stood here before me? Her silence answered that well enough. 3 warriors stepped forward from the circle. One carried braided leather rope, dark with age. Another, a sealed clay vessel. The third, a bundle wrapped in cloth that seemed, faintly, to move. Takian gestured. The first man approached with the rope. Senna translated. And Jonah felt each word land like a small stone dropped straight into his chest. The first test is endurance, she said. You will be tied to the post. You will stand while the sun crosses the sky. You will not sit. You will not lean. You will not call out. A pause. Something close to regret behind her eyes. If you fall before the sun touches the western wall, you fail. Jonah looked up. Directly overhead. Which meant hours. Maybe 6, standing under a sun that had already killed better men than him. He was 40 years old. Not 20. But refusing meant dying now. Accepting meant, at least, a chance. He nodded. Didn't trust his voice not to shake. They bound his wrists behind the post. Wet rawhide cold against his skin. He knew exactly what that meant. As it dried in the sun, it would shrink. Tighten. Turn his hands numb, and then take them somewhere worse than numb. They set his feet shoulder-width apart. Marked the ground around them, with a line of white powder. Move his feet from those marks, Senna said quietly, and he would fail. Then they stepped back. And Jonah stood alone in the center of the circle. 400 pairs of eyes fixed on him, with an intensity that felt like people who had traveled a long way to witness either justice, or a spectacle, or possibly both at once, and didn't much care which. The sun felt like it was burning holes through the top of his skull. Sweat soaked through his shirt within minutes. The position forced his chest forward, and his shoulders back, made every breath a decision he had to make on purpose. His arms, pulled back around the post, began to ache almost immediately. A dull throb that he already knew would only get worse. The warriors watched. Silent. No one moved. No one spoke. They just stared. Tracking every twitch. Every flinch. Every crack in the wall he was trying to build around the pain. An hour passed. Maybe 2. Time stopped meaning anything under that sun. His legs started to tremble. Small at first. Then not so small. His shoulders screamed. His wrists, cut by the tightening rope, began to bleed, warm at first, and then sticky, as it dried against his skin. Through the haze, he saw Senna watching, from the front of the circle. Face giving nothing away. But her hands gripped her horse's mane, so hard her knuckles had gone bloodless white. She needed him to survive this. That thought became an anchor. When his knees threatened to buckle, he grabbed onto it. When the pain in his shoulders turned to fire, he thought about what failure would cost. Not just him. Her too. The sun crawled, each minute stretching into something that felt like an hour on its own. His vision blurred at the edges. His tongue felt too large for his mouth. Flies landed on his face, and he couldn't lift a hand to brush them off. One walked across his eyeball, and he had to blink it away, and even that small motion felt like a defeat, though he hadn't fallen. Not yet. He saw things that weren't there. Eleanor, standing in the circle, belly swollen with the child she never got to hold, face pale with the pain that eventually took her too. He blinked. She was gone. He saw a boy playing in the dust. A boy who would have been 11 now. 12. He'd lost count of the birthdays he never got to have. He blinked again. Empty ground. Time collapsed into one long, unbroken moment of suffering. Jonah stopped fighting the pain. Started trying to become it instead. Let it fill every space in him, until there was no line left between his body and the agony. He remembered something an old scout had told him once, back in Wilcox, a man who'd survived worse than this, and lived to talk about it in a saloon that had long since burned down. Don't fight it. Flow with it. It's the fighting that breaks you, not the pain. So he stopped fighting. He let it move through him like water through a canyon. Let his breathing sink, with the faint sway of the post against his spine, becoming part of the wood, part of the dirt, part of the fire overhead. An old warrior, the one who'd spoken, with quiet authority earlier, rose from where he'd been sitting. Walked to the edge of the arena. Sat cross-legged. Began to chant. Low. Wordless. Full of something Jonah couldn't name, but could feel in his chest. Within minutes 3 others joined him. Their voices building a strange harmony that filled the whole canyon. Some of the younger men frowned. One, ambition burning plain in his eyes, spoke sharply toward the old man. The chanting didn't stop. After a moment, the young one fell silent. Jonah didn't understand what was happening, but he felt something shift. The chanting wrapped around him like a blanket. Didn't ease the pain, but made it a little more bearable. Reminded him he wasn't entirely alone in it, even out here, tied to a post surrounded by 400 strangers, who mostly wanted him dead. The shadow of the western wall began its slow crawl across the arena floor. Jonah watched it the way a drowning man watches a rope. Inch by inch. Thick and slow, as honey, creeping toward the white line around his feet. His knees had locked. Locked so hard he wasn't sure he'd ever get them to unlock again. His whole body shook, exhaustion, pain, the sheer effort of remaining upright one more second, and then one more after that. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime folded into a single afternoon, the shadow touched the line. Takian stood. He crossed the arena with slow, measured steps. And Jonah thought, this is it. This is the moment I find out. The chief drew his knife. The same obsidian blade he'd driven into the ground back at the cabin. Jonah's exhausted mind couldn't process what came next fast enough. The blade came down. Cut the ropes in one clean motion. Jonah's arms fell forward, and the relief hit, so hard it was almost violent, a rush that whited out his vision for one full second. His knees unlocked. His whole body swayed. 400 warriors leaned in, as one, to see if he'd fall now. After everything. After all of it. In the last possible moment, Jonah locked his knees again. With whatever was left in him. And stood. Barely. Swaying like a tree in a hard wind. But standing. Takian spoke one word. Loud. Meant for everyone. And the warriors erupted. Not with hostility. With something closer to approval. They struck their spear butts against the ground in a rhythmic pounding that Jonah felt through the soles of his boots, before he even registered it as sound. Even the young, ambitious one was pounding his spear into the dirt, swept up in whatever this was despite himself. Senna's face flooded with a relief so total she couldn't hide it. Tears stood in her eyes. She blinked them back before they could fall. She translated, voice trembling now, no longer able to keep it perfectly steady. "You have passed the first test," she said. "But understand. What comes next is harder. The second test does not measure your body. It measures your judgment. And men with strong bodies often carry weak minds." They let Jonah collapse, though even that was controlled, a sitting fall, not a sprawl. Some shred of dignity preserved on purpose. His hands were still bound in front of him. A reminder. Not fully trusted yet. An older woman approached with a water skin. Allowed him one small sip. No more. When he looked at her, confused, she said something short and sharp. Senna translated. "Drink too fast, you vomit. Then you fail what comes next." The woman examined his wrists, cut deep enough to need tending. Applied a paste that smelled of yarrow, and something else Jonah couldn't name. "Wrap them in clean cloth." She said nothing, but she nodded once before she walked away. And Jonah understood that was respect. Hard-earned. Grudgingly given. Takian spoke again, his tone different now. Still serious. But not hostile. Senna leaned closer to translate. "My father says you passed the first trial, with honor," she said. "Your body proved strong. Surprising for a man of your years." A pause. "But the body is easy. The mind is harder. Rest. 20 minutes. Then it begins. 20 minutes. Not enough to recover from 6 hours of what his body had just survived." And Jonah understood, sitting there in the dirt, with his ruined wrists wrapped in clean cloth, that this was precisely the point. He was still thinking about the water skin an hour later. About restraint. About what it cost a man to hold back, when every cell in his body screamed for more. He looked over at Senna, who sat a short distance away, watching the horizon like she expected trouble to arrive from it at any moment. "You said your father sent you into the desert to learn a lesson," Jonah said, voice still rough. "What was the lesson supposed to be?" Senna didn't look at him right away. "That kindness has a cost," she said finally. "That a stranger's help is never simple. Was he right?" She was quiet a long moment. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me again after today." Jonah almost smiled. Almost. His lips were too cracked for it to hold. "Fair enough," he said. Because that was the thing about this whole morning. Nothing about it had been simple. Not the travois. Not the turquoise. Not the way she looked at him yesterday like she was reading something written on the inside of his skull. Which meant none of what came next was going to be simple either. And Jonah understood that in his bones now, the way you understand weather changing, before the first cloud shows up on the horizon. Something in the air. A pressure dropping. Except he had no idea yet how deep this particular storm was going to run. Had no idea that the woman sitting near him, watching the horizon, with that same unreadable calm, had staged the whole encounter herself. Had chosen him. Deliberately. Not her father's design at all, her own, a private experiment about whether an outsider could be trusted, conducted at the risk of her own life, because she needed to know the answer badly enough to gamble everything on finding it. He didn't know that yet. So he sat in the dirt, with his wrists wrapped in yarrow paste, and he waited for the second trial, and he thought about Eleanor, and about a summer 12 years back he tried very hard never to think about, and about how strange it was that the worst morning of his life had somehow also become the first morning in 12 years, that he hadn't felt entirely, completely alone. Until the second warrior stepped forward, carrying the sealed clay vessel. And the real test began. The warrior broke the wax seal, with a kind of ceremonial care that made Jonah's throat tighten before he even smelled it. Water. Clean. Cold. Mountain spring water, unmistakable even from 10 feet away. His cracked lips ached at the scent of it. Every cell in his body screamed for it. For relief. For the simple, animal mercy of something wet against the throat that felt lined with sand. And then the warrior tilted the vessel, poured its contents onto the ground. The water vanished in seconds. Gone, like it had never existed at all. Jonah stared at the wet stain already fading in the heat. And he understood, with a clarity that cut straight through the fog of exhaustion, that this had never been about whether he was thirsty. Senna's voice cut through the silence. "The second trial is not about pain," she said. "It is about choice. Do you take? Or do you give?" Her eyes held his. "Choose wrong, you die. No one will tell you which is correct." The warrior held the empty vessel toward him, waiting. And Jonah, exhausted, bleeding, more dehydrated than he'd ever been in his life, had to decide what the right answer was, while every instinct in his body screamed at him to reach for what was being offered. His eyes moved across the circle of watching faces. Young men sweating in the heat, restless horses beneath them. Older men whose weathered skin told stories of decades in this brutal country. They had ridden 4 hours to get here. Sat through 6 more, watching him suffer in the sun. And in all that time, Jonah realized it slow, like a fact surfacing from underwater, he hadn't seen a single one of them drink. 10 hours. No water. In heat that would have put most men on their knees. They'd imposed on themselves the same deprivation they'd imposed on him. Willingly. As part of witnessing whatever this was. That kind of discipline didn't come from nowhere. Jonah thought of a drought back in his homesteading days. A man named Patterson, who'd hoarded his well water, while the whole valley went dry around him. Within a month, nobody would trade with him. He was gone by autumn. Not driven out by violence. Driven out by the simple, quiet refusal of decent people to stand near a man who only thought of himself. Eleanor used to say it different, lying beside him some nights back, before everything, listening to wind against the walls. Water shared his life, Jonah. Water hoarded his death for everyone. His hand trembled as he reached out. But instead of taking the vessel, he pushed it back. Gently. Toward the warrior holding it. "Give it to them," he said, voice a rasp. He gestured with his bound hands toward the circle. They rode far. They waited long. Their thirst matters too. For 3 full heartbeats, nothing happened. The warrior holding the vessel looked stunned. Like this wasn't a response he'd ever seen, or expected to see. Then a murmur moved through the crowd. Warriors nodding slowly, like something they'd hoped for, but hadn't dared expect had finally shown up. The old warrior who'd chanted during the first trial struck his fist against his chest. A gesture that needed no translation. Others followed. Even some of the younger, more skeptical faces. The sound of fists against chests rolled off the canyon walls like a slow drumbeat. Takian walked forward. Studied Jonah with new intensity. When he spoke, his tone had changed. Less judge. More teacher. Senna translated, relief threading through every word now. "You have proven you understand the second law," she said. "A man who thinks only of himself dies alone in the desert. A man who thinks of others first will never thirst, because others remember, and they carry him." The warrior raised the vessel high for everyone to see. Drank first. Passed it. Each man took 2, maybe 3 swallows, disciplined even in thirst, sharing equally until it came back empty to the center of the circle. A different warrior refilled it, from a larger bag. Brought it to Jonah. This time, when it was offered, he understood he was allowed. He drank. 3 careful swallows, fighting the urge to gulp it all in one motion. Restraint mattered here, as much as the choice itself. It was the best thing he'd ever tasted in his life. Takian spoke again. Senna's voice dropped, warning threading through her translation now. "You have passed 2 trials," she said. "Body and mind both proven worthy. But the third is the one that matters most. It will show what you truly value. What you would sacrifice. A pause. Many men have strong bodies. Some have wise minds. Few have honest hearts. This is where most men fail. The third warrior stepped forward, carrying the cloth bundle. He unwrapped it, with a reverence Jonah recognized from church, from funerals, from anything people treated as sacred without needing to say so out loud. Inside was a knife. Even from a distance, Jonah could see it wasn't ordinary. The blade was black obsidian, nearly 9 inches, worked into something, so fine it could split a hair down its length. The handle was wrapped in soft deerskin, worked through with turquoise, and red coral, and pale shell and patterns, that told a story he had no way of reading. This wasn't a weapon. This was made from love. Takian took the knife from the warrior, held it with a tenderness that transformed his whole face, hard stone giving way to something achingly human underneath. When he spoke, his voice had changed too. Softer. Senna's own voice thickened as she translated. "This knife belonged to my wife," he said. "Elania. She made it herself, over 8 moons. Obsidian from a sacred quarry, 40 miles north. Each bead traded from different peoples across hundreds of miles." He touched the blade like it might still hold her warmth. "She made it, as a gift for our marriage day. I gave it to our daughter, when she was born, so she would always carry something of us both." Senna's voice broke slightly. She had to stop. Start again. 14 winters ago, Takian continued, soldiers raided our winter camp. At dawn, while we slept, my wife shielded our daughter with her own body. A soldier's bullet found her instead. His jaw tightened. She died so our child could live. This knife is the only thing I have left of her. Her hands. Her voice. Her love. I would die before I lost it. The weight of that story settled over the whole arena like something, with actual mass. Jonah understood now why this was the final test. Why it was the one that broke men. It wasn't about right answers. It was about what was left of a person once everything else got stripped away. Takian set the knife down on the ground between them, obsidian catching the afternoon light. He spoke. Senna's translation barely above a whisper now. Yesterday, this knife was in her travois. You fixed the travois. You could have seen it. Could have taken it. You didn't. A pause that stretched too long. But maybe only because you didn't know what it was worth. Didn't know who she was. Takian's next words landed like a trap closing shut, slow and final. So I ask you, stranger, if you had known who my daughter was yesterday, if you had known this knife was there, hidden inside her travois, would you have helped her still? Or would you have taken the blade and left her stranded in the desert? Jonah's mind reeled. There was no right answer here. Say he would have helped anyway, and they'd call him a liar, because men were selfish, everyone knew it, that was simply the way of the world. Say he would have taken the knife, and he was confessing to being exactly the kind of man who preyed on the vulnerable. Say he didn't know, and he was a coward, dodging the question entirely. He thought back, through the different men he'd been at different points in his life. At 28, freshly arrived in this territory, with Eleanor and a heart full of foolish hope, he'd once found a Mexican farmer's lost money pouch. $35. Returned it without a second's hesitation. But that was before loss taught him the world's real terms. 5 years back, he'd ridden past the family under attack. Heard the shots. Seen the smoke rising. And kept riding because it wasn't his fight, wasn't his problem. He learned later the whole family died. Father. Mother. Both children. He'd carried that particular weight every single day since. So which Jonah would have stopped for Senna, if he'd known what she carried, and who she was. The young idealist. The bitter widower. The man haunted by a road he hadn't turned down, when it mattered. He honestly didn't know. And that uncertainty felt worse than any lie could have. He looked at Takian. At Senna. At the circle of warriors waiting. Then he said the only true thing he had left. I cannot answer that question. The reaction was immediate. Explosive. Warriors shouted. Some rose to their feet, hands moving toward weapons. The young, ambitious one from before stepped forward, hand on the handle of a tomahawk. He refuses the question, he said, loud enough to carry. He admits guilt by his silence. Other voices joined. Angry. Confused. The careful structure of the whole ceremony seemed to be tearing loose at the seams. Takian's face darkened like weather changing fast, and Jonah understood he was one wrong word from death. Senna looked stricken. Pale. But Jonah kept talking. Raised his voice over the chaos, before it could drown him entirely. I cannot answer, he said, because I will never be that man again. The one who stopped yesterday not knowing the stakes. That version of me made a choice based on ignorance. The crowd quieted slightly. Confused now more than angry. Today, Jonah pressed on. I know exactly who your daughter is. I know about Alanya. I know what this knife means to both of you. The man standing here right now is not the same man who stopped his horse yesterday afternoon. We are never the same person we were yesterday. Every choice changes us. Every single one. He took a breath. His bound hands reached for the knife lying between them. So I can't tell you what yesterday's version of me would have done. Maybe he takes it. Maybe he doesn't. I honestly don't know, and pretending otherwise would be a lie. He picked up the knife. Obsidian cold and smooth against his skin. But I can tell you what today's version of me does. He held it out towards Senna. I would help you again. Even knowing everything I know now. Even if it cost me my life. Because some things matter more than staying alive. The knife trembled in his outstretched hands. Take it. It was always yours. The silence that followed felt absolute. Even the horses seemed to hold still, waiting to see what happened next. Senna stepped forward slowly. Took the knife from his hands. Her fingers brushed his for a fraction of a second, and Jonah saw tears running down her face now, unhidden, unashamed. She turned to her father. Spoke in her own language, voice clear and steady despite the tears. Whatever she said made several of the older warriors nod, slow, thoughtful. Takian took the knife back from his daughter. Examined it like he was seeing it for the first time, running his fingers over beadwork his dead wife had made, with her own hands. When he looked up at Jonah, something new lived in his eyes. Recognition, maybe? Like he'd finally looked past the pale skin and settler's clothes to something underneath. He spoke at length, his voice carrying across the valley. When he finished, warriors struck their chests again, that same salute. Senna translated, wonder in her voice now. My father says you have answered a question no man has ever answered correctly. Others claimed they would help, and we knew they lied. Others admitted they would steal, and we killed them for their honesty, but no honor in it. She paused, making sure every word landed. You said something new. You said you don't know who you were. But you know who you are. You said we are not prisoners of our past selves. That every sunrise we can choose to become someone different than we were the day before. Takian handed the knife back to Senna. A gesture that carried more weight than Jonah could fully grasp. He turned to face the assembled warriors. Raised both hands high above his head. Spoke in a voice that rang off the canyon walls like something struck. And when he finished, the warriors answered as one. 3 times. A sound Jonah felt in his chest more than heard. Then they dismounted, all of them, striking their spear butts into the earth in a pounding rhythm that shook the ground under his feet like something alive. Senna moved closer, close enough to speak beneath the noise. You have passed all 3 trials, she said. My father declares you a man of true heart. One who acted, without knowing the stakes, and would act the same, knowing everything now. Relief lived in her voice. But Jonah noticed her shoulders were still tight. like she didn't quite trust that the danger was finished. It wasn't. One rider remained mounted, while every other warrior had dismounted. The young, ambitious one. He hadn't cheered. Hadn't struck his spear. He sat there, jaw set, eyes burning with something that looked, uncomfortably, like grief wearing the mask of anger. He waited until the celebration died down. Then he spoke. Loud. In English, so there could be no misunderstanding. He has passed 3 trials of single moments, he said. I have a 4th question. The warriors who had just been celebrating fell silent. Takian turned slowly. His expression unreadable. Senna stiffened beside Jonah. He heard her draw in a sharp breath. This wasn't part of the ceremony. This was something else. The young warrior dismounted. Deliberate. Unhurried. He was perhaps 27, built for combat, scars marking him, as someone who'd seen real fighting, and not just ceremony. Old man, he said, addressing Jonah directly now, English heavily accented but clear. You pass tests of body, mind, heart. But these are tests of single moments. I ask about a lifetime. He turned to Takian. Switched to his own language. Senna translated in a low whisper only Jonah could hear. He says, we honor this stranger, but do we know his past? Maybe he helps one woman, once. But maybe before that, he has killed our people many times. A different kind of murmur moved through the warriors now. Not the earlier chanting rhythm. Doubt, creeping back into something that had felt, moments ago, resolved. Jonah felt his stomach drop. This man had found the weak point in the armor. The one question that could unravel everything Jonah had just survived to earn. The warrior turned back to him. Eyes hard as flint. You say you are 40 winters. You came to this territory in 1880. 12 years. 12 years during a time of war between our peoples. His voice rose. Were you part of the militia? Did you fight against my people? Did you kill Apache warriors defending their own land? He let the questions hang there, thick as smoke. Because if you did, he said, then every pretty word about kindness and change means nothing. You are our enemy. And we are honoring you, with the blood of our brothers still fresh on your hands. Jonah could have lied. There was no record to prove otherwise. No way for anyone in this valley to check. But he built the entire 3rd trial on honesty. On admitting what he didn't know rather than pretending certainty he didn't have. To lie now would undo every inch of ground he just earned. He met the young man's eyes. And chose the truth. Even knowing it might be the last true thing he ever said. Yes, Jonah said. I fought against Apache. Not as militia. As a homesteader defending land I believed was mine. He looked around at the faces watching him. Some hostile. Some curious. All waiting. I came to this territory in the spring of 1880, he said. With my wife. Eleanor. Her name still caught in his throat, 12 years on. We were poor. Desperate for a fresh start. What was left of our home in Tennessee had burned during the war. The government promised free land, if a man could work it. 160 acres, if he survived 5 years. We didn't know this land was already claimed, he said. We didn't know, or maybe we chose not to know, that your people had lived here for 300 years. We just saw empty desert, and believed it belonged to us, because paper somewhere in Washington said so. His voice roughened. We arrived that spring. Built a cabin. Dug a well. Eleanor was already carrying our child by the time we crossed into the territory. We thought we'd found our place in the world. He stopped. Made himself keep going. Then came the raid. That same summer. Our neighbors 5 miles east. Warriors came for horses and supplies. Your people had been pushed off hunting grounds. Food sources destroyed. They were raiding because they were starving. He swallowed hard. We didn't think about that then. We only thought we were being attacked. He met the young warrior's eyes directly. My neighbor fought back. 2 of your people died in that fight. 1 of ours was wounded. The whole community panicked, thought more raids would follow. So 20 of us formed a group. Tracked the raiders. I was the best tracker among the settlers. I'd hunted my whole life, back in Tennessee. I led them to a camp hidden in the mountains. His breath shook. The fight was chaos. Your people had scouts. They saw us coming. It wasn't a massacre. It was a battle. A man died. I fired my rifle. I believe my shot found him. I've never been fully certain, and I have spent 12 years not letting myself look at that too closely. He paused. I saw his face afterward. He said. He was young. Trying to feed his family, same as I thought I was trying to feed mine. And standing there, looking at him, I understood he'd been defending his home exactly the same way I believed I was defending mine. The only difference was, whose home the paper in Washington decided mattered. He looked down at his bandaged wrists. 3 months after that fight, my wife's time came. 18 hours of labor. No doctor for 40 miles. She died, and our son died with her before that first year in this territory had even finished turning over. I was left alone, with blood already on my hands, and nothing left in my chest but ash. He met the young man's eyes one final time. I've lived alone ever since. 12 years. I told myself it was penance. That if I stayed away from people, I couldn't hurt anyone else again. But isolation isn't penance. It's just cowardice wearing a quieter name. Silence sat heavy over the whole valley. The young man was quiet a long moment. Then, carefully, he asked, "What month was this raid?" "July," Jonah said. "Middle of July, 1880. Why?" The young man's face had gone strange. Tight. "What was the settler's name?" he asked. "The one who died in the fight." Jonah's stomach dropped again. "I don't know his name," he said honestly. "I only know the man I believe I shot. If it was my shot at all." "No," the young man said. "Our man. The one you say your people believe was fighting for us that day." Jonah closed his eyes. Forced the memory up whole, unwilling as it came. "Kotani," he said quietly. That was what one of the other trackers called him afterward. I only heard it once, at the burial we gave the settler side. I've carried that name 12 years, without ever saying it out loud until now. The young man's face broke. Grief and fury moving across it in the same breath. "I was there," he said, voice cracking. "I was 15 winters. My first real fight. My chance to prove myself." His hands trembled. "Kotani was my brother. He was teaching me how to track. How to survive in a world that was already closing around us." The silence that followed was total. Even the wind seemed to stop. Jonah felt like something had been driven straight through his chest. "I found him," the young man went on, voice raw now. "After the fight. Held him while he went cold. I swore that day I would kill every white man I ever met. Make them all pay for what had been taken." He looked at Jonah, with eyes that carried a lifetime of grief. "I should kill you now," he said. "Every part of me wants to." He paused. "But I listened to your story, and I hear something I didn't expect. I hear guilt. I hear regret. I hear a man who carries the same weight I carry. Who lost family the way I lost family. Who lives with ghosts the way I live with mine." He lowered the knife. Slowly. "You didn't kill for pleasure," he said. "You killed because you were afraid. Because you believed you were defending your home." His jaw tightened. "I killed settlers that day too. Does that make me evil? Does that make you?" He shook his head. "We were enemies," he said, "because we wanted the same land, for different reasons. The land doesn't care who claims it. But people die for those claims. Over and over." He extended his hand. Not the settler's grip. Palm to palm, The way warriors met as equals. I don't forgive you, he said. Maybe I never will. But I do not kill you either. Because you are a reflection of me. We both killed. We both lost. We both carry scars that will never fully close. Jonah took the offered hand, felt the strength in it, and the tremble underneath, the true cost of what this had taken. Thank you, Jonah said. Because there were no other words that fit. Takian had watched all of this, without a word. Now he stepped forward. Spoke, and Senna translated, her own voice thick, with tears now. I have lived long enough to see much war, her father said. I fought Americans, Mexicans, other tribes. I have killed good men, who were not evil, only enemies. He looked at Jonah for a long moment. When my daughter met you yesterday, I tested her judgment. I wanted to know if all outsiders were the same. All take. All kill. All lie. He paused. Today I learn, no. Some carry pain the way we carry pain. Some want peace the way we want peace. Some grow. Some change. He gestured to the old warrior, who had chanted during the first trial. The man brought forward a leather cord threaded with 3 stones. White. Red. Black. Takian tied it around Jonah's wrist, with his own hands. A gesture heavy, with meaning Jonah didn't yet fully understand. You are proven, stranger, he said. Not innocent, you are not innocent. Not fully forgiven, some things cannot be forgiven whole. But honest. Humble. Changed. Any of my people who see these stones will know you were judged and found worthy of respect. Not friend. Not enemy. Respected. The warriors struck their chests again. And this time, even the young man, Rutan, Jonah would learn his name was, before this long day finally ended, struck his own chest, fist against skin, with real force behind it. Senna stepped close, and before anyone could stop her, before she seemed to fully decide to do it herself, she embraced him. A gasp moved through the gathered warriors. A boundary crossed that shouldn't have been crossed. But Takian didn't object. And that silence, Jonah understood, was its own kind of blessing. The sun had begun its slow slide toward evening now, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold that Jonah suspected he'd remember for whatever remained of his life. Takian spoke once more. Tonight we ride to your cabin, he said. We feast. Tomorrow, you are free to return to your life. He paused. And something in his face shifted, an offer forming behind the words, that hadn't come yet, an offer that would change the shape of everything Jonah thought his remaining years were going to look like. But if you wish, the chief said, there is another road. Stay. Learn our ways. Teach us yours. Be something between our 2 worlds, that this land is going to need very badly, very soon. Jonah looked down at the 3 stones now resting against his wrist. Felt their weight settle into him like something that had always belonged there, and had simply been waiting, for 12 long years, for him to finally come and claim it. I need time to think about that, he said. But even as the words left him, some quiet part of Jonah already suspected what his answer was going to be. He just didn't know, yet everything that answer was going to cost. The fire that night burned higher than Jonah had ever seen a fire burn. Not out of anger anymore. Out of something else. Something closer to relief, maybe, though nobody said that word out loud, because these were not people who wasted words on feelings that actions could say better. Women arrived from somewhere Jonah hadn't even noticed, riding a separate trail, with cooking pots lashed to their saddles, blankets, dried meat, baskets of something sweet he couldn't name yet. They moved around the fire, with a rhythm he didn't understand. Roles divided. Distinct. But nobody barking orders. Nobody standing above anybody else. He watched it the way a man watches something he's never seen before and knows, somewhere in his gut, that he's about to need to learn it. Because that's what this was starting to feel like. A lesson. Beginning. Food passed around the circle in a specific order. Elders first. Then the proven, and Jonah realized, with a jolt that landed somewhere behind his ribs, that word now applied to him. Then the younger men. Everyone took exactly their share. No more. No less. His coffee, the little he'd carried from Wilcox, tucked in his saddlebag out of habit more than plan, got passed around like something rare. Young warriors crowded close to watch him boil it, over the open flame, faces lit gold, asking questions in a language he couldn't answer yet. He answered anyway. With his hands. With the shape of his mouth trying words that weren't his. They laughed. Not unkindly. And Jonah realized somewhere in that laughter that this was the first time in 12 years anyone had laughed near him, without him flinching from the sound of it. Senova, the old man who'd chanted through the worst of the first trial, settled beside him, with the careful, deliberate motion of a body that had earned the right to move slow. "You did well, white man," he said. His English came broken. Careful. Like something handled, with respect because it wasn't fully his own. "I am 67 winters. I was proven at 23. A pause. Eyes crinkling. You. 40. Proven today. Different roads." He tapped his own chest. "Same place we land." He told Jonah, in pieces, about being taken by Mexican soldiers once, years back. About escaping. About being tested, when he made it home, because his own people needed proof he hadn't turned traitor in captivity. "I pass," Senova said simply. "Like you passed. We are brothers now. In surviving." Rutan came later. Still carrying tension in his shoulders the way a man carries a weapon he hasn't decided whether to put down yet. "I don't like you, old man," he said. Blunt. No warm up to it. Jonah almost smiled. "Fair. But I respect you." Rutan's jaw worked. "You didn't beg. Didn't lie about what you'd done. Faced the truth even, when the truth could have killed you." He paused. Something moved behind his eyes that looked, for a second, almost young. That is warrior behavior. He struggled with the next part. Jonah watched him struggle. Didn't rush him. "I am sorry," Rutan said finally. "About your wife. Your loss." "I'm sorry about your brother," Jonah answered. "About Kotani." Rutan flinched at the name. Recovered. "Sorry does not bring them back," he said. "No," Jonah agreed. "But maybe saying it out loud helps carry it a little." Rutan looked at him a long moment. Then nodded. Slow. Like he just passed one more test he hadn't known he was taking. It was Senna who brought him the special portion. Roasted rabbit heart, wrapped careful in corn husk, and she set it in his hands like it weighed more than it looked like it should. "In our way," she said quietly, "the heart goes to the honored guest. It means your presence has earned trust. That we see you, as worthy of our most unguarded selves." She hesitated. And what came next felt less like custom, and more like something only she was saying, to only him. "You gave me back my mother's knife," she said. "I give you this. We are connected now. Whether either of us chooses it or not." Jonah took the offering, with hands that hadn't fully stopped shaking since dawn. And understood, this was more than food. This was a promise. Later, when most of the camp had drifted towards sleep, Takian found him. Senna came too, walking a few steps behind, close enough to translate, far enough to let the two men speak like men. The chief's offer, once Senna laid it out plain, wasn't complicated. Stay 3 moons. Learn. Teach. Help when the time came to speak, with the Indian agent in a language white men would actually listen to. "After 3 moons, Takian said through Senna. "If it does not work, leave with no shame. But if it does," he let the sentence sit unfinished, the way important sentences sometimes deserve to. Jonah's hesitation must have shown plain on his face, because Takian added, quieter now, "I am old. I have maybe 5 more winters. I need someone who understands both sides of the fight, that is taking my people apart, piece by piece. He studied Jonah for a long moment. You understand loss, the old chief said. You understand surviving something at terrible cost. That is not a small thing to understand. Let me sleep on it, Jonah said. I'll answer in the morning. Takian nodded. Good. Think carefully. This is not a small decision. Jonah didn't sleep. He sat by the dying fire long, after everyone else had found their blankets, mind turning over arguments the way a man turns, over stones looking for something underneath. Against staying. He was 40. Too old, maybe, to learn a language that didn't bend for anyone. Too set in 12 years of habits built specifically to keep him from needing anybody. He'd fought Apache once. Would always, on some level, be the outsider here. And back in Wilcox, what family he had left in, that world would call him traitor the second word got out. For staying, what exactly did he have, if he rode home? 12 years of nothing had already told him the answer to that question, and the answer was nothing. Today, this one impossible day, he'd felt more alive than he had, since Eleanor's hand went slack in his. These people had tested him. Truly tested him. Found him worthy. And there was Senna, who needed an ally in whatever fight she was fighting to earn a voice in her own future. There was Takian, carrying a weight no man should carry alone. There was Rutan, who'd found a way to choose connection over 12 years of grief-shaped rage. Jonah closed his eyes. Pictured Eleanor the way he used to, sitting beside him on quiet Tennessee nights, before the war took the shape out of everything. What would you want? He asked the dark. And her voice came back to him the way it always did. Patient. A little amused at how long it had taken him to ask. I'd want you to live, Jonah. Not just exist. Live. By sunrise he had his answer. He found Takian already awake, sitting cross-legged, watching the light come up over the canyon rim. Jonah didn't need words for this part. He knelt. Held out the wrist carrying 3 small stones. Takian looked at him a long moment. Then nodded once. Sharp. Final. Good, the chief said, in English, one of the very few words he owned in Jonah's language. We begin. They rode for his cabin the next morning, and Jonah felt something strange happening in his chest the whole way there. Something he didn't have a name for yet. He would learn, over the coming weeks, that it was called purpose. It had been so long since he'd carried any, he'd almost forgotten the shape of it. The first month nearly broke him. In a different way than the trials had. The language was nothing like English. Sounds his tongue had never been asked to make. Clicks. Tones that shifted a whole word's meaning, if you leaned on the wrong syllable. He made mistakes constantly. Embarrassed himself in front of children half his age, who could say in a heartbeat what took him 5 full minutes to fumble through. Except the children never laughed the way he feared they would. They just corrected him. Patient. Like teaching a very large, very slow-moving animal how to speak. Senova took him under his care most days. Taught him to read the desert differently than he'd ever read it before. Every disturbed stone. Every bent blade of grass a sentence in a language older than any of them. How to find water, where the ground swore there wasn't any. How to navigate by wind and star and the particular-shaped mountains through against a night sky. And Senna taught him words by the fire most evenings. Pointing at objects. Speaking their names. Waiting while he repeated them badly, over and over, until something in his mouth finally clicked, into the right shape, and she'd nod small, satisfied, like watching a plant finally break the surface of the dirt it had been fighting through. Sometimes Takian joined them. And through broken sentences stitched together, from 3 different vocabularies, Jonah began to understand the shape of the man's mind. His fears for his people. His fierce, stubborn determination to preserve whatever could still be preserved, even as the whole world outside this valley kept closing tighter around it. Because that was the part nobody in Wilcox ever talked about honestly. That the war wasn't a war anymore. Hadn't been, not really, for years. It was something slower now. Quieter. Paperwork instead of gunfire. Boundaries redrawn a little smaller every season, the way water erodes stone, not all at once, just steadily, until one day you looked up, and the whole shape of the thing had changed, and you couldn't say exactly when. Jonah started to understand that. Living inside it instead of reading about it, from a safe distance. Which changed something in him. Slowly. The way most real changes happen, not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small ones stacked up, until you turn around, and realize you're standing somewhere completely different than where you started. 6 months in, he was splitting his time between the cabin and the camp. Some weeks mostly here. Some weeks mostly there. Word got back to Wilcox, the way word always finds its way back no matter how far out you think you've gotten, from town gossip. Indian lover, some called him now, when he came in for supplies. Apache sympathizer. Old Henry Thompson, who used to trade him flour on credit, without blinking, started making him pay up front. Started looking somewhere, over Jonah's shoulder instead of at his face, when he spoke to him. It should have hurt more than it did. Except it didn't. Because by then Jonah had found something that mattered more than Henry Thompson's opinion of him. Which was a strange thing to realize about a man you'd known 15 years, and a stranger's respect you'd earned in one single unbearable afternoon. So he stopped going into town more than he had to. And the camp, slowly, quietly, without either of them ever quite naming the moment it happened, became more like home than the cabin had felt in a very long time. Senna was the one who suggested he start writing things down. They were sitting by the fire one evening in the fall, the air finally starting to carry the first edge of cool that meant the brutal summer heat had broken. "You should keep record," she said. "The stories the elders tell you. The customs. If no one writes them, they disappear. Like water into sand. You could write them," Jonah said. "Your own hand. Your own words." Something flickered across her face. "Complicated. I have other work," she said. "Work my father does not yet fully trust a woman to do out loud, in council, in front of other men." She said it plain. No self-pity in it. Just fact laid out flat on the table between them like something she'd made peace with a long time ago, and was simply, patiently, working to change. "Then I'll write," Jonah said. "You tell me what needs remembering. I'll get the words down." She studied him a long moment. "Why does this matter to you?" she asked. "Our stories. Our record. You could have ridden home the day after the trials. Kept your distance. Called it enough." Jonah thought about that a while before he answered. Because it deserved a real answer, not a quick one. "Because I spent 12 years disappearing," he said finally. "Making myself smaller. Making sure nothing I did left a mark on anything." It felt safe. He looked into the fire. It wasn't living. It was just waiting. For something. I didn't even know what. He looked up at her. "This feels like the opposite of that," he said. "And I'd like more of it. Before I run out of time to have it." Senna didn't say anything for a while. But she didn't look away either. And that, Jonah was starting to learn, meant more from her than most people's whole speeches meant from them. He started the journal that autumn. Leather-bound. Cheap paper, the best Wilcox had to offer, since he still had to go into town sometimes no matter how unwelcome he'd become there. He wrote down everything the elders would let him. Senova's stories about tracking. About the old trade routes that used to stretch farther than any map Jonah had ever seen drawn true. Senna's memories of her mother, careful, at first, given only in small pieces, like she was testing whether the words would hurt less coming out than staying in. They didn't always hurt less. But she kept giving him pieces anyway. "My mother used to say," Senna told him one night, staring into the fire instead of at him, "easier that way. That a person is not one thing. That we carry every version of ourselves we have ever been, all at once, like stones in a pouch. Some heavy. Some light. You do not throw the heavy ones away. You just learn to carry the whole pouch, without letting it bend your back. Jonah wrote that one down word for word. Didn't trust his memory to hold it exactly right, and some things he was learning deserved to be held exactly right. She sounds like she was wise, he said. She was 29 when she died. Senna said. Wisdom does not need a long life. It only needs attention. Jonah looked up from the page. You were how old? He asked. Gentle. When it happened? 11. Senna's jaw tightened, just slightly. I remember the weight of her falling on top of me. I remember thinking, for one terrible second, that she had simply tripped. Her voice went very quiet. It took me a long moment to understand what had actually happened. That she had chosen it. On purpose. In the space of half a breath. Jonah set the pen down. Didn't reach for her. That wasn't his to do, not yet, maybe not ever. He didn't know the rules well enough here to be certain. But he stayed. Sat close enough that his silence could do some of the work words weren't built to do. Thank you, he said eventually, for telling me that. Senna wiped at her eyes quick, almost angry at herself for the tears. I don't usually tell it, she said. Not even to my own people. It is easier, somehow, to give it to someone who wasn't there. Who didn't know her. There is less, she searched for the word. Expectation. In how I am supposed to say it. Jonah understood that better than he wanted to admit. He'd spent 12 years not telling anybody about Eleanor for almost exactly that same reason. By the time snow dusted the higher ridgelines, that winter, thin, rare snow, gone again within a day, Jonah had stopped thinking of the cabin as his real home. The camp had become that instead. Slowly. Without ceremony. The way a river doesn't announce the moment it changes course, it just does, and one day you look at the map, and the water simply isn't where it used to be. He still kept the cabin standing. Still rode back some weeks, mostly out of habit, mostly because some stubborn part of him wasn't ready yet to admit out loud how completely everything had shifted. But it was the fire in the camp he found himself thinking about on the nights he wasn't there. Senova's slow, careful stories. Rudin's grudging half-smiles, which had started coming more often than Jonah suspected the man himself realized. Senna's voice teaching him words by firelight, patient as the desert itself. He hadn't said it out loud. Not to her. Not to himself, not fully, not yet. But something had shifted in him that went beyond gratitude. Beyond friendship, even. Something he wasn't ready to name, because naming it felt like admitting he could lose it. And losing things, that was a fear Jonah understood in his bones better than almost anything else in this life. Because here was the thing nobody warned him about, in 12 years of learning to survive alone. Loneliness was terrible. But loneliness was also, in its own miserable way, safe. Nothing to lose, if you never let yourself have anything. And now he had something. Which meant, for the first time in over a decade, Jonah Ward had something worth being afraid of losing again. The trouble started, the way trouble usually does, small enough at first, that nobody thought much of it. Spring 1893. Nearly a year since the morning 400 warriors had circled his cabin. Jonah rode into Wilcox for supplies he couldn't get any other way, flour, nails, a new blade for the plow. He still kept working at the old homestead, mostly out of a stubbornness he couldn't fully explain even to himself. The town felt different than it used to. Colder toward him, sure, he'd gotten used to that. But there was something else in the air too. New. Restless. Men clustered outside the general store in a way men only clustered when there was money to be made, or trouble to be started, and usually both those things traveled together. Jonah caught pieces of it, while he loaded his cart. Survey crew. Coming through. Government business, somebody said. Somebody else said it wasn't government at all, it was private, some outfit out of Tucson, with backing from somewhere further east. Land's changing hands? A man Jonah half recognized said, loud enough to be heard, the way men talk, when they want to be overheard. Reservation boundaries getting redrawn. Good grazing land, too. Shame to let it sit. Jonah's hands went still on the sack of flour he was loading. Redrawn how? He asked, before he'd fully decided to speak at all. The man looked at him. Recognition flickering, then something colder settling over it once he placed who Jonah had become around here. Asked the agent. The man said. Dismissive. Ain't my business. Ain't yours either, way I hear it, unless you've gone and turned Apache altogether now. He walked off before Jonah could press further. Jonah stood there a long moment, flour sack heavy in his arms, that old cold feeling creeping back up his spine. The one from a year ago. The one that had woken him at dawn to 400 riders circling his home. Except this time the danger wasn't wearing war paint. This time it was wearing a survey crew's canvas coat, and carrying paperwork instead of a spear. He asked around careful, the way a man learns to ask around, when he's not sure yet who's listening, or what it might cost him, if the wrong ears caught it. Took 2 days. But he got a name. Not the surveyor's name. The name of the man who'd hired the surveyor. The man with backing, apparently, from somewhere further east, and a fresh appointment, as the government's man handling boundary questions on this stretch of the territory. Bishop. Jonah heard the name, and felt something drop through the floor of his stomach. Because he knew that name. He'd known it 12 years, buried under a summer he'd spent most of his life trying not to look at too directly. Captain Bishop. Militia commander. The man who'd led 20 settlers up into those hills in the summer of 1880. The man who had, Jonah now remembered, with a clarity that turned his blood to ice water, been strangely insistent that day. Pushing the group harder than the actual danger seemed to call for. Talking about the raid like it was an opportunity, as much as a threat, in a tone none of the frightened, grieving settlers around him had thought twice to question at the time. Jonah had been young. Scared. Grieving in advance for a wife he didn't, yet know he was about to lose. He hadn't questioned Bishop's urgency that day. He was questioning it now. He rode back to camp faster than he'd ridden anywhere in a year. Found Senna first. Told her what he'd heard, the words tumbling out of him faster than he meant them to, because once he started he couldn't seem to stop himself from getting it all out at once. A survey crew, he said. Government business, they're calling it. Or maybe not government at all, nobody in town seems clear on that part, which worries me more than if they were clear on it. Redrawing the reservation boundary. Grazing land. Good land. Senna's face had gone very still. How much land? She asked. I don't know yet. Jonah shook his head. But I know the name behind it. He told her about Bishop. About the summer of 1880. About a man who'd pushed a scared, grieving group of settlers into the hills a little harder, and a little faster than the actual threat seemed to warrant. Senna listened without interrupting. Her jaw set tighter with every sentence. You think he wanted the fight to happen? She said when he finished. Not a question. A conclusion she'd already arrived at. I think, Jonah said slowly, working it out loud, as he said it, that a fight gives a man an excuse. To push a boundary. To claim land was too dangerous to leave in. He stopped. Made himself say the actual words instead of dancing around them. In your people's hands. Easier to take ground, from folks the government's already decided are the enemy. Senna's eyes had gone hard. My mother died 2 years before that summer, she said quietly. Different soldiers. But I have always wondered whether they answered to the same hand. Jonah felt something cold settle into his chest. Wondered what? Whether the raids in those years, Senna said. The soldiers, the militia, all of it, whether any of it was truly about defense at all. Or whether someone, somewhere, was making a great deal of money off the fear. They took it to Takian that same evening. The old chief listened in silence, the way he listened to everything important, letting the whole account land fully, before he responded to any single piece of it. When Jonah finished, Takian sat quiet a long moment. Firelight moving across a face that had gotten thinner over the past winter than Jonah wanted to admit to himself he'd noticed. This land, Takian said finally, through Senna's translation, is what remains, after everything else was already taken. His hand, when he raised it, wasn't quite steady. If they take this too. He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Rutan, who'd been listening, from the edge of the fire, spoke up, voice tight. We fight, he said. Simple. Immediate. With what? Senna said, sharper than Jonah had heard her speak to him before. Bows against surveyor's paper? You cannot win a war fought in ink, with spears written. We tried that already. It did not go well for us. Rutan's jaw tightened. But he didn't argue the point. Takian raised a hand, and the tension in the circle settled, at least on the surface, the way it always did, when the old chief chose to speak. Jonah, he said. You know this man. Bishop. I knew him once, Jonah said. 12 years ago. For one summer. I didn't know him well even then. But you know his kind, Takian said. You know the paper world he moves inside. The world my people cannot read. Jonah felt the weight of what was being asked, before Takian even finished laying it out. You want me to go back into that world? He said slowly. Find out what's real. What he's actually planning. Can you do this? Takian asked. Without him learning you are doing it for us. Jonah thought about Wilcox. About Henry Thompson refusing him credit now. About every eye that turned away from him in that town since the day he'd chosen to stay. He thought, too, about a face he hadn't seen in 12 years, and what it might cost him to stand in front of it again. I can try, he said. It took him 3 weeks to get close enough to learn anything real. He started small. Careful. Asked questions that sounded like idle town gossip instead of the desperate investigation they actually were. Bought a drink for a clerk at the land office, who liked to talk more than his job probably allowed. Rode out, once, just to look at the surveyor's stakes himself, counting the distance between them, with an old farmer's practiced eye, doing the math on how much ground those little wooden markers were quietly claiming. More than he'd feared. Considerably more. And then, on a hot afternoon in early June, almost exactly a year to the day, since he'd woken to 400 riders circling his cabin, Jonah walked into the land office in Wilcox, and found himself standing face to face with Bishop for the first time in 12 years. The man had aged the way men age who've spent their whole lives comfortable, and certain they're in the right. Softer around the middle now. Hair gone mostly gray. But the eyes were the same. Cold. Calculating. The eyes of a man who had never once, in his entire life, doubted that he deserved whatever he was currently in the process of taking. Jonah Ward, Bishop said, and something moved behind those eyes, quick, assessing, before settling into something that wanted to look friendly, and didn't quite manage it. Been a long time. 12 years, Jonah said. Heard some things about you, Bishop said. Casual. Too casual. Heard you've gone, and made yourself right at home out there, with the Apache. Living among them now, they say. Some of the time, Jonah said, keeping his voice level. Came for nails and flour. Nothing more complicated than that. Bishop studied him a long moment. Long enough that Jonah felt the weight of it settle uncomfortably across his shoulders. Funny thing, Bishop said finally. I've got survey work happening out past the eastern boundary line right now. Government business. Very official. He smiled, and the smile didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Be a shame if certain parties got the wrong idea about what that work involves. Started stirring up trouble that didn't need stirring. Jonah kept his face still. 12 years of solitude had at least taught him that much, how to keep a still face over whatever storm was moving underneath it. I don't know anything about your survey work, Jonah said. Not my business. No, Bishop agreed. It surely isn't. He let the silence stretch a beat too long. Long enough to make sure Jonah understood exactly what kind of silence it was. Course, Bishop added, almost as an afterthought, turning back to the papers on his desk like the conversation had already ended. Man in your position, friendly with the tribe the way you are, might find himself useful to me. If he wanted to be. There's opportunity in a project like this. For a man willing to help things go smooth. Jonah felt something harden in his chest. And if a man wasn't willing, he said. Bishop looked up. And for just a second, the friendly mask slipped enough that Jonah saw exactly what was underneath it. Then I suppose that man, Bishop said quietly, had better make sure he's on the right side of whatever paperwork gets filed. Because paperwork, Mr. Ward, paperwork has a funny way of deciding who owns what, regardless of how anybody feels about it. Jonah rode back to camp, with that conversation looping in his head the entire way. Because it wasn't a threat. Not exactly. Bishop hadn't said one single word a lawyer could pin down as a threat. Except it was one. Every word of it. Wrapped up polite, and dressed in government language, but a threat all the same, and Jonah had understood every syllable of what wasn't being said out loud. He found Senna at the edge of camp, watching for him the way she'd taken to doing lately whenever he rode into town, though either of them had ever said out loud that she did that, or why. You saw him, she said. Not a question. I saw him. And... Jonah dismounted. Let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since he walked into that land office. He remembers me, he said. He knows I'm close with your people now. He as good as told me to stay out of his business. Or make sure I ended up useful to it instead. Senna's eyes went sharp. Useful how? He didn't say directly. Jonah shook his head. That's not how men like him talk. But the meaning was plain enough. Help him. Or find myself on the wrong side of whatever gets filed with the government. Filed how? Senna pressed. What is he planning? I don't know yet, Jonah admitted. But I intend to find out. It took him another 2 weeks. Careful, patient work, the kind that couldn't be rushed, without risking everything unraveling, before he had proof solid enough to matter. He befriended carefully, without pushing too hard, a young clerk in the land office named Whitfield, who Jonah had noticed drank more than his salary should have allowed, and complained, when he drank, about how unfair his own pay was compared to what certain other men in this territory were quietly pocketing. It took 3 separate visits, 3 separate rounds paid for out of Jonah's own thin pocket, before Whitfield finally said enough, loose-tongued and resentful, to make the whole shape of it click into place. Bishop wasn't acting alone. He had backing, investors out of Tucson, maybe further, men who wanted the grazing land on the reservation's eastern edge, and didn't much care how the boundary got redrawn to give it to them. The survey wasn't measuring the existing line. It was measuring a new one. Smaller. Considerably smaller. And once that new survey got filed, and stamped by the right office in the territorial capital, it would become the official line. Legal. Binding. No fight required. No raid. No excuse needed at all. Just paper. Quiet, patient, unstoppable paper. When? Jonah asked Whitfield, careful to keep his voice even, like this was idle curiosity, and nothing more. Surveys due to finish end of summer, Whitfield said, slurring slightly. Filing goes in right after. Once it's stamped. He shrugged, the careless shrug of a man who'd already decided this wasn't his fight to have an opinion about. Once it's stamped, that's just how the map reads from then on. Don't much matter what was true before. Jonah rode back to camp that night with a knot in his stomach that hadn't loosened by the time he arrived. He found Takian by the central fire, and this time he didn't wait for the proper moment, or the right formality. He simply told them everything, straight through, no pause, the words falling out of him fast, because slowing down to choose them carefully felt like a luxury they didn't have time for anymore. The survey wasn't official yet. Wouldn't be, not until it was filed. Which meant there was still a window. Small. Closing fast. But real. "How do we stop paper?" Burton said, when Jonah finished. His voice carried none of its earlier hostility now. Only a kind of exhausted, furious helplessness that Jonah recognized, because he'd worn that exact expression himself, more than once, over these last 12 years. "With better paper," Jonah said. "Or with the right person seeing the wrong paper, before it gets filed?" Takian studied him a long moment. "You have an idea," he said. Not a question. "I have the start of one," Jonah admitted. "I need to go to the territorial capital. Find out who Bishop answers to. Find someone above him, who might care more about doing this honestly than about whatever Bishop's investors are paying to make it happen quietly." "That is a long ride," Senna said. "And a dangerous one for you to make alone." "More dangerous," Jonah said, "to do nothing, and watch this land disappear out, from under all of you, while I stood by being careful." Senna looked at her father. Something passed between them, wordless, the kind of understanding that 14 years of trust and grief had built between them long before Jonah ever arrived to complicate it. "I will go with him," Senna said. Takian's expression shifted. Something like worry moving across it, quickly suppressed. "That is not without its own danger," he said. "A woman of our people, traveling that road, into that world. Neither is staying here, and watching our land taken from under us, while we wait for someone else to act," Senna said. Steady. Unmovable. "I have spoken before councils, father. I understand how their paper world reads. Jonah understands the words. I understand what those words are worth to us. We need both." Takian was quiet a long moment, weighing something Jonah couldn't fully read. Finally, he nodded. Slow. Reluctant. But real. "Go," he said. "Both of you. But go carefully. And go quickly. Summer does not wait for us to be ready." They left 3 days later, before dawn, while the camp still slept. Jonah had made this kind of ride before, alone, more times than he could count across 12 years of solitude. It felt entirely different now, with Senna riding beside him instead of only silence keeping him company. They didn't speak much the first hour. The desert around them slowly waking, into pink and gold, the kind of light that had once felt, to Jonah, like nothing more than the backdrop to another empty day. It didn't feel empty anymore. It hadn't, in fact, felt truly empty in almost a year now, though he was still getting used to admitting that to himself. "You're frightened," Senna said eventually, watching him from the side, without quite turning her head. "A little," Jonah admitted. "Not of the ride. Of Bishop. Of failing," Jonah said. "Of standing in front of your father again, and telling him I couldn't find a way to stop this." Senna was quiet a moment. "You already stopped something once," she said. "A year ago. Standing in a doorway, with 400 warriors ready to end you. You did not fail that day. That was different," Jonah said. "That was one man's judgment. This is—" He gestured out at the land stretching around them, the whole enormous, indifferent weight of it. "This is paper, and money and men who've never once had to look anyone in the eye, while they decided to ruin their life. Then we make them look," Senna said simply. "Whatever else happens. We make certain someone looks." They rode 3 days to reach the territorial capital, sleeping rough, sharing what little food they packed, and somewhere in those 3 days, Jonah couldn't have named the exact moment even, if pressed, the silence between them stopped being careful, and started being comfortable instead. On the second night, camped beside a dry creek bed under a sky so full of stars it looked almost crowded, Senna asked him something she hadn't asked before. "Do you regret it?" she said. "Staying?" Jonah looked over at her, firelight catching the edge of her face. No, he said. Immediate. No hesitation in it at all. Not for one single day. Even now, Senna pressed. With all of this. Especially now, Jonah said. Because a year ago, none of this would have mattered to me at all. I would have stayed inside my cabin, kept my head down, minded my own dirt, the way I minded it for 12 years. This, he gestured between them, at the fire, at the whole impossible ride they were in the middle of. This is the first thing in longer than I can properly remember that's felt worth being afraid about losing. Senna didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had gone quieter than he'd heard it before. I feel that also, she said. I did not expect to. When I broke my mother's travois on purpose, that day you first found me. Jonah went very still. You broke it on purpose, he said slowly. Senna's eyes met his across the small fire. And there was no hiding in them now. No careful distance. I wanted to know, she said, whether an outsider could be trusted. Whether kindness given, without knowing the cost, was still real kindness, or only performance for an audience the stranger didn't know was watching. She looked down at her hands. I did not expect the stranger to be you. I did not expect any of what came after. Jonah sat with that a long moment. The revelation settling slow, the way truths sometimes needed to settle, before you could feel the whole shape of their weight. You risked your life, he said finally. To test a theory. I risked my life, Senna corrected. To find an answer I needed badly enough to gamble everything on getting it. She looked up at him. I did not expect to also find. She stopped herself. Jonah waited. Didn't push. I did not expect to find someone I did not want to lose. She finished quietly. The fire popped between them. Neither of them moved to fill the silence that followed. And Jonah understood, sitting there under a crowded desert sky 3 days, from anywhere either of them called home, that whatever this was between them had stopped being simple gratitude a long time ago, on both sides, and neither of them had said so out loud, until this exact moment. Senna, he started. Don't, she said. Gentle. Not a rejection. Something else. Not yet. Let us finish what we rode out here to do first. There will be time after. If we are careful. If we are lucky. Jonah nodded. Throat tight in a way he hadn't expected. After then, he said. They reached the capital on the third afternoon, dust-covered and saddle-sore, and Jonah spent 2 frustrating days being turned away, from office after office, before finally, through a contact Whitfield's loose tongue had pointed him toward, they found a junior clerk in the Territorial Land Bureau willing to actually look at what they'd brought. Survey notes Jonah had copied by hand, from what he'd glimpsed at the Wilcox office. Whitfield's slurred but consistent account, which Jonah had written down word for word the same night he'd heard it, dated and detailed enough to hold up, as something more than rumor. And Senna's own careful, precise account of the existing boundary, drawn from memory of a line her people had walked, and defended for longer than any territorial map had existed at all. The clerk, a careful, quiet man named Osgood, who seemed to genuinely believe in the job he'd been hired to do, which Jonah was starting to understand might be rarer than he'd have guessed, studied everything they'd brought for a long, silent while. This is serious, Osgood said finally. If even half of what you're alleging is accurate. It's accurate, Jonah said. I'll need more than your word, Osgood said. Not unkindly. Just honest. I'll need to see the survey stakes myself. Compare them against the original filing. He looked between the two of them. This could take weeks. And I should tell you plainly, men like Bishop tend to have friends in offices like this one. I am not entirely certain I can protect what happens once I start asking the wrong questions out loud. How much time? Senna asked. Before the filing goes through. Osgood checked a ledger. His face changed slightly, as he did the math. If the survey finishes on schedule, he said, The filing window opens in 6 weeks. Once it's filed and stamped, it becomes the map. Jonah finished. Regardless of what was true before. Osgood nodded, grim. That's the trouble with paper, Mr. Ward. Once it's official, the truth underneath it stops mattering to most of the people who'll ever look at it again. They rode back toward camp, with 6 weeks standing between them, and whatever came next. 6 weeks to prove a lie, before that lie hardened into something the whole territory would treat as permanent fact. It wasn't much time. But it was, Jonah told himself on that long ride home, considerably more than no time at all. And for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, he found himself grateful for something he hadn't expected to ever feel grateful for again. He wasn't facing this one alone. Senna rode beside him the whole way back, quiet most of the time, but present in a way that made the miles feel shorter than they had any right to. And somewhere on that ride, without either of them naming it out loud a second time, Jonah understood that whatever came next, Bishop's paperwork, the survey stakes, the whole cold machinery grinding toward a boundary line, that would decide the shape of an entire people's future, he was going to face it, as something other than the man who'd woken alone in a cabin a year ago. He was going to face it, as a man, who finally, after 12 empty years, had something worth fighting to keep. They reached camp on the 5th day to find Takian waiting by the central fire, thinner than Jonah remembered him even, from a week ago, a stillness in his face, that hadn't been there, before they left. "Father," Senna said, dismounting fast, worry sharpening her voice. "What's happened?" Takian waved off her concern, with a tired hand. "Nothing that cannot wait for your report," he said. "Tell me what you found." Jonah and Senna laid it out together, Osgood, the 6-week window, the fragile chance they now carried to stop a lie from becoming permanent truth. Takian listened in silence, the firelight carving deep lines into a face that looked, to Jonah's careful eye, considerably older than it had a year ago. Older than a single winter should have made any man look. When they finished, the old chief was quiet a long while. 6 weeks, he said finally. "That is not much time to save what took 300 years to build." "It's what we have," Jonah said. "It's enough to try." Takian looked between the two of them, Jonah, and his daughter standing close beside him in a way that hadn't been true a year ago, in a way the old chief's tired eyes clearly noticed and, for now, chose not to remark on. "Then we try," Takian said. "All of us. Together." He rose, slower than Jonah remembered him rising a year ago, one hand pressed briefly against his side in a way he tried, and mostly failed, to hide. "But understand this," Takian said, looking at Jonah directly now, voice carrying a weight that went beyond the boundary line, beyond the survey stakes, beyond even Bishop himself. "This man, Bishop, he took something from my family once already. My wife. My people's trust in a peace that was never real to begin with." His eyes darkened. "If he comes for what remains this time, I intend for him to learn exactly what it costs a man to underestimate what my people are still willing to protect." The fire cracked and settled between them. And somewhere out past the canyon walls, past the boundary line, that 6 weeks of paperwork was quietly conspiring to erase. Jonah understood that whatever came next wasn't going to be decided only in land offices and survey stakes. It was going to be decided here. In this camp. By these people. And he was, for better or for worse, standing now fully inside it. Not an outsider anymore. Not a guest. Something closer, at last, to family. 6 weeks. That was the number that lived in Jonah's chest now, ticking somewhere behind his ribs whether he was asleep or awake. Because that was all the time standing between the world, as it existed today, and the world Bishop wanted to draw on a piece of paper, and stamp into permanence. 6 weeks to prove a lie, before the lie hardened into fact. So they worked. Jonah rode to Wilcox more than he wanted to, more than was safe, probably, buying Whitfield drinks he couldn't afford, coaxing loose threads out of a man who talked more the drunker he got, and regretted it more the soberer he got the next morning. Senna worked the other end of it, gathering accounts from elders, who remembered the old boundary the way their bodies remembered breathing, not from any map, but from walking it, generation after generation, feet against dirt, that had never once needed a survey stake to know where it belonged. And Takian grew thinner. Jonah noticed it first in small things. The way the old chief's hand pressed against his side, when he thought no one was watching. The way he sat down a half-second slower than he used to. The way, some mornings, he simply didn't rise, with the sun the way he had every single morning of the year Jonah had known him. Nobody said the word out loud yet. But everybody was starting to think it. Because that was the thing about grief, Jonah was learning. It didn't wait politely for a convenient season. It didn't care that there was a boundary line to save, a chief's daughter's future to protect, a whole people's grazing land hanging in the balance of 6 fragile weeks. Grief just arrived. On its own schedule. And demanded to be carried alongside everything else. Which meant Jonah found himself, 3 weeks into the count, sitting beside Takian's bedding one evening, while Senna slept, finally, after 4 nights of barely sleeping at all, nearby. "You are frightened for me," Takian said. Quiet. Not a question. "Yes," Jonah admitted. No use lying to this man. He tried lying to him once, in a doorway a year ago, and it hadn't gone particularly well. Takian almost smiled. The ghost of one, anyway. "I have buried a wife," he said. "Buried warriors I raised from boys. I have watched 300 years of my people's ground shrink smaller, with every season I've been alive to witness it." His breath rattled faint when he drew it in. "Death does not frighten me, Jonah. I have made my peace with it many winters ago." "What frightens you, then?" Jonah asked. Takian was quiet a long moment. "That I will not live to see whether this land, at least, survives," he said. "That my daughter will carry this fight alone, the way I carried too much of it alone, for too many years, before you arrived to help carry it too." "She won't be alone," Jonah said. Immediate. No hesitation in it. Takian looked at him. Something moved behind the old man's tired eyes, recognition, maybe, of a promise being made, that went considerably further than any single boundary dispute. "Good," he said simply, and closed his eyes to rest. 4 days later, Jonah finally found the thread that mattered. He'd gone back to Whitfield one more time, this time with a bottle of something better than what Whitfield could afford on his own salary. And somewhere past the 3rd glass, Whitfield's tongue loosened enough to say something Jonah almost missed entirely, tossed off casual, like it wasn't the whole shape of everything finally clicking into place. "Bishop's an old army man," Whitfield slurred. "Did you know that? Before all this land business. Captain back in the 70s. Before he came into money." Jonah went very still. "What kind of army business?" he asked. Careful. Keeping his voice light even, as something cold began crawling up his spine. "Frontier stuff," Whitfield said, waving a loose hand. "Winter campaigns. Cleared out camps, that sort of thing. Made his name on it, I heard. Before he figured out there was more money in land than in metals." Jonah's mind went somewhere very far away for a moment. Somewhere back to a fire, and a knife, with turquoise worked into the handle, and Takian's voice, cracking slightly, telling a story about soldiers arriving at dawn, while a whole camp slept. 14 winters ago. "What winter campaign?" Jonah said. His voice had gone flat. Careful. Because he already knew the answer, before he finished asking the question, the way you know a wound is bad, before you've even looked at it directly. Whitfield shrugged, oblivious to what he was handing over. 78, I believe. Winter camp, up near the Ridge country. Big to do about it at the time, I heard. Man made captain off that one. Jonah sat there a long moment. Glass untouched in front of him. Because it wasn't 2 separate men. 2 separate sins, floating loose and unconnected across 12 years of Jonah's own private guilt. It was one man who had led soldiers into a sleeping camp in 1878 and left a girl of 11 years old alive only because her mother's body had absorbed the bullet meant for her. The same man who, 2 years later, had pushed 20 frightened settlers into the hills a little harder and a little faster than the actual danger called for, engineering a fight that killed Kotani and left Jonah carrying a guilt he'd spent 12 years trying not to look at directly. The same man who was now, in this exact season, quietly redrawing a boundary line to finish the job he'd started 14 years ago. Jonah's hands had started shaking again, the way they had that first dawn, 400 riders circling his cabin. Except this time it wasn't fear making them shake. It was something colder, older, something that had been waiting a very long time to finally have a name attached to it. He rode back to camp through the dark, faster than was safe, faster than his horse probably deserved to be pushed, because this couldn't wait until morning. This couldn't wait one single unnecessary hour. He found Senna still awake by her father's fire, watching the old man sleep, and the look on Jonah's face must have told her something, before he'd even said a word, because she was on her feet, before he finished dismounting. "What?" she said. Sharp. Braced. "Bishop," Jonah said. Breathless, the ride still in his lungs. The winter camp. 14 years ago. It was him. Senna went very still. "Say that again," she said. "Quiet. Dangerous quiet." "The raid that killed your mother," Jonah said, forcing the words out steady even, though nothing in him felt steady at all. "The officer who led it. It was Bishop. Before the land money. Before any of this. He made his name on it." Senna didn't move for a long moment. Then something shifted in her face. Something Jonah had never seen on her before, not during the trials, not during the ride to the capital, not even that night by the fire, when she told him what she'd risked and why. This was rage. Old. Banked. Finally given something solid to attach itself to, after 14 years of having nowhere to go. "He is the reason I do not remember my mother's voice clearly," Senna said. Her own voice had gone very flat. Very controlled in the way that controlled things are sometimes the most dangerous kind. "He is the reason my father has spent 14 winters carrying a grief he never let himself finish grieving, because there was always another fight waiting." Senna. "And now," she continued like he hadn't spoken at all, "he wants our land too." The same man. Twice. Jonah reached for her hand. She let him take it, though her whole body was still rigid. "We're going to stop him," Jonah said. "Not with a knife this time. With paper. With the truth laid out so plainly that no clerk in that whole territory can look away from it." Senna looked at him. Something in her face cracked, just slightly, grief finally finding a small opening to slip through the anger. "Promise me," she said. "I promise," Jonah said. He didn't know yet, standing there in the dark, with her hand gripped in his, whether it was a promise he'd actually be able to keep. But he meant it, with everything he had left to mean anything with. They took the Discovery to Osgood 4 days later, riding hard for the territorial capital, with barely 2 weeks left, before the filing window opened. Osgood listened to the full account, Whitfield's drunken revelation, the dates lining up, 1878 and 1880 both leading back to the same man's hand, and something changed in the careful clerk's face, as the pieces settled into place in front of him. "If this is true," Osgood said slowly, "and if I can find the army records to confirm it, this isn't only a boundary dispute anymore." "No," Jonah agreed. "It isn't. This becomes a question of character," Osgood said. "Whether a territorial land agent, with this history, should be trusted, with any authority, over any boundary touching any tribe at all." He looked up at them, something grim and determined settling behind his careful eyes. "That is not a small thing to bring in front of the territorial governor's office. Bishop has friends. money behind him. This will not go quietly. We don't need it to go quietly, Senna said. We need it to go true. Osgood studied her a moment, then nodded slow. I'll find the records, he said. Give me 1 week. The week that followed was the longest of Jonah's entire life. Longer, somehow, than the 6 hours he'd once spent tied to a post under a merciless sun. Because at least, that day, he'd only had his own life on the line. This time it was Takian's failing health. Senna's grief, finally given somewhere to go, and still not knowing what to do, with all of it. An entire people's remaining grazing land. And somewhere underneath all of it, quiet, persistent, a fear Jonah hadn't let himself examine too closely yet, that even if they won this fight, even if Osgood found every record he needed, and Bishop was stripped of every ounce of his authority, it still wouldn't be enough. Because there would always be another bishop. Another survey. Another 6 weeks, somewhere down the road, when the whole terrible cycle started over again. That thought kept him awake most nights that week. Until he found himself saying it out loud to Senna, sitting by the fire on the 5th night, unable to keep it locked inside any longer. Even if we win this, he said, it won't be the last time. Senna didn't answer right away. She was quiet long enough that Jonah wondered if she'd simply chosen not to respond to something that painful. No, she said finally. It won't be the last time. Then what's the point? Jonah said. And hated himself immediately for how it sounded, how close it came to the old cabin-bound, world-avoiding man he used to be, the one who'd learned that hopelessness, at least, was safe. Senna turned to look at him directly. The point, she said, is that this time we win. This particular fight. This particular piece of ground. Her voice hardened, steady, certain. We do not get to win every fight that is coming. No one does. But we get to win this one. And then, when the next one comes, we fight that one too. That is not defeat, Jonah. That is simply what surviving looks like. It always has been. Jonah sat with that a long moment. And understood slowly that this exact stubborn refusal to let hopelessness win even one single unnecessary inch of ground, was probably the truest thing anyone had ever taught him. Osgood's letter arrived 8 days later. Delivered by a rider who'd pushed his horse hard the whole way, from the capital. Jonah read it twice, before he trusted himself to believe what it said. Army records confirmed. Bishop's full service history, including the 1878 winter campaign, a campaign that, according to the very reports Bishop himself had filed at the time, had specifically targeted a camp known to be sheltering non-combatants, in direct violation of standing orders. Records that Bishop, apparently, had assumed were buried too deep in some forgotten archive for anyone to ever bother digging them back up. There was more. A formal hearing had been scheduled. Territorial Governor's Office. 2 weeks out, which put it, Jonah realized with a jolt, exactly 1 week, before the filing window on the survey was due to close. Cutting it as close as it was possible to cut it. We need witnesses, Osgood had written. Anyone who can speak firsthand to the events of 1878 and 1880 in front of the governor's panel. Written testimony alone will not carry the weight this needs. Jonah brought the letter straight to Takian. The old chief had grown noticeably weaker over these past 2 weeks, thinner, slower, spending more hours resting now than sitting upright by the fire the way he used to. But his eyes, when Jonah read the letter aloud, sharpened with something that looked, for a moment, almost like the man Jonah had first met a year ago, drawing a knife into the ground, with enough force to make the whole earth shudder. I will go, Takian said. Father, Senna started, alarm plain in her voice. The ride alone. I will go, Takian repeated. Firm. Final, in the way his voice had once been final, when he'd sentenced a stranger to 3 trials in a hidden canyon. This is my wife they wish to hear about. My people's land. I will not send others to speak what only I can speak, with my own voice, while I still have breath left to speak it. Nobody argued further after that. The hearing took place in a room too small and too formal for the weight of what was about to happen inside it, a governor's office building in the territorial capital, wood paneling and heavy curtains, and a long table, where 3 men in dark suits sat waiting to decide, in the space of one afternoon, whether 14 years of quiet theft would finally be named out loud. Bishop was already seated when Jonah, Senna, and Takian arrived. He looked up, and for just a fraction of a second, something flickered behind his composed expression, surprise, maybe, or the first real crack of fear Jonah had ever seen on that carefully controlled face. It didn't last long. Bishop smoothed it over fast, the way men like him always did. "Mr. Ward," he said, extending a hand Jonah didn't take. "Didn't expect to see you here. Nor your—" His eyes moved to Takian and Senna, something cold sliding into his voice. "Companions. We have business with this panel," Jonah said. "Same as you." Bishop's smile thinned. "I look forward to hearing it." Osgood presented first. Careful. Methodical. Laid out the survey discrepancy in plain, patient terms, the true boundary versus the boundary Bishop's crew had quietly begun marking, the 6 weeks, that would have turned that quiet discrepancy into permanent law if nobody had caught it in time. Bishop, when given his turn, was smooth. Practiced. Talked about progress, about efficient use of underutilized grazing land, about the territory's growth requiring difficult, but necessary decisions. He almost made it sound reasonable. Until Osgood produced the second set of documents. The Army records. The room went very quiet, as Osgood read the relevant passages aloud, the 1878 campaign, the specific orders Bishop had been given, the specific orders Bishop had chosen to ignore. Bishop's composure cracked, just slightly, at the edges. "That was 14 years ago," he said. Sharp. Defensive in a way he hadn't allowed himself to sound all afternoon. "Wartime conditions. Difficult decisions made under." "There was no war that winter," Takian said. The old chief's voice, when it finally broke the formal proceedings, carried a weight that made even the governor's panel sit up straighter. Bishop turned. Looked at him properly, maybe, for the first time. "There was a family," Takian continued, each word deliberate, unhurried, carrying 14 years of grief finally given the room to speak itself out loud. "Sleeping. At dawn. My wife carried our daughter to safety, with her own body, because there was no other shelter fast enough to reach." His voice, remarkably, did not break. "You called it a campaign." "I call it what it was. A woman shielding a child from a man who had already decided, before he ever arrived, that neither of their lives mattered enough to spare." Bishop's face had gone pale. "I don't have to sit here and listen to." "You will sit," said the man at the center of the panel, the governor's own representative, voice suddenly hard in a way it hadn't been all afternoon. "And you will listen," continued Chief Takian. Takian continued. He spoke of the years after. Of raising a daughter who never knew her mother's voice clearly enough. Of watching 2 years later another settlement's worth of grief manufactured by the same man's hand, the same appetite for land dressed up in the language of necessary defense. And then it was Jonah's turn. He stood. Felt the whole room's attention shift toward him. Felt, underneath it, an echo of a different circle of eyes. A year ago, 400 warriors watching him step out of a cabin doorway, with nothing but the truth to protect him. "In 1880, Jonah said, I was part of a militia group Bishop led into the hills, chasing what he told us was a raiding party. He kept his voice steady, though it cost him everything he had to keep it that way. I have spent 12 years believing that fight was necessary, that it was defense. I have carried the weight of a man's death from that fight every single day since, believing, at least, that it had been unavoidable." He looked directly at Bishop. "I have since learned," Jonah said, "that the urgency that day did not come from any real danger. It came from a man who understood that fear makes settlers do exactly what he needs them to do, and that a dead Apache warrior makes for a very convenient excuse to redraw a boundary line afterward. The room had gone completely silent. "I killed a man that day," Jonah said. "His name was Kotani. I have carried that. I will carry it the rest of my life." His voice hardened. "But I did not carry it alone, into that fight, gentlemen. I carried it, because a man in a captain's uniform told 20 frightened settlers that our lives depended on moving fast, and none of us thought to ask him why he seemed so certain, so early, that there was anything worth fighting over at all." Bishop had gone rigid in his seat. "This is—" he started. "Sit down, Mr. Bishop," the governor's representative said. "Cold now. Final." The panel deliberated for 3 days. 3 days that felt, to Jonah, considerably longer than the 6 hours he'd once spent tied to a post. But when the decision finally came, it came clean and complete. The survey was voided. The original boundary line reinstated, formally, permanently, filed and stamped, with the date that beat Bishop's own filing window by 2 full days. Bishop himself was stripped of his position, his authority revoked, his name attached now to a record that would follow him considerably further than any land deal ever could have. It wasn't everything. It wasn't justice for 1878, not really. No hearing, no strip title, could hand back what had actually been taken, that dawn 14 years ago. But it was something. Real. Solid. A line on a map that would stay where it belonged, at least for now, because 4 people had refused to let a lie quietly become permanent, while there was still time left to stop it. They rode home slower than they'd ridden out. No urgency left to push against. Just 3 tired people, and the long, patient miles of desert opening up ahead of them in the late summer light. Takian rode between them for most of it, quieter than usual, but something in his posture had eased, that Jonah hadn't seen eased in weeks. "You did not have to speak that day," Takian said to Jonah, somewhere on the second afternoon, without preamble. "About Kotani. About your own guilt in it." "I did have to," Jonah said. "It was the only way to make the rest of it believable." A man who admits his own worst part is a man worth trusting on everything else. Takian considered that a long moment. "That is a hard way to live," he said. "Always giving your worst truth first." "It's the only way I know how to live now," Jonah said. 12 years hiding taught me that hiding doesn't actually protect anybody. It just makes the eventual reckoning heavier. Takian looked at him. And something passed across the old chief's face that Jonah would carry with him for the rest of his life, something between pride and gratitude and a grief so old it had finally found a small measure of rest. "You are my son now," Takian said. Simple. Final, the way his voice went final, when a decision had been made, and would not be revisited. "Whatever comes after me. Whatever you and my daughter decide between yourselves. You are my son. I say this in front of the sky, so it is heard." Jonah's throat closed too tight to answer properly. "Thank you," he managed finally. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough, not for everything this man had given him. But it was what he had. Takian died 3 weeks later. Peacefully. In his sleep, in the small hours before dawn, in a season that had finally, mercifully, allowed him to rest. Jonah sat with Senna, through that whole terrible day, and the days after it, and understood, watching her grieve, that this was a different kind of trial than any post, or blade or bowl of water could have ever tested him with. Because grief didn't ask you to prove anything. It just asked you to stay. So he stayed. Through the burial, conducted with a ceremony, Jonah had by now learned enough of the shape of to understand its full weight, though he still didn't have all the words for every part of it. Through the long, quiet weeks after, when Senna barely spoke, when the whole camp moved slower, softer, wrapped in a morning that Jonah could feel in the air itself, thick as smoke, that wouldn't clear. And through the evening, nearly 2 months after her father's death, when Senna finally turned to him by the fire, and said the thing they'd both been carrying, unspoken, since a night beside a dry creek bed under a crowded desert sky. "My father called you his son," she said. "In front of the sky. He meant it as more than words, Jonah." "You understand that?" "I do," Jonah said. "Then say what you have been carrying," Senna said. Steady. Direct, the way she had always been direct, even in the worst of it. "Because I am tired of both of us being careful, with something that does not need carefulness anymore." Jonah looked at her. 12 years of solitude sitting behind him like a country he finally, fully left. "I love you," he said. Simple. No decoration on it, because it didn't need any. "I have for longer than I let myself admit. I want to build whatever remains of my life here. With you. However that needs to look, for as long as I have left to give it." Senna's eyes filled, and this time she didn't blink the tears back. "Then build it," she said. "With me." They married that autumn, in a ceremony that borrowed from both worlds, and belonged fully to either, the way Jonah himself had learned to belong fully to either one anymore. Rudin stood witness. Senova spoke the old words. And somewhere in the middle of it, Jonah found himself thinking of Eleanor, not with the old, sharp grief that used to ambush him at the worst possible moments, but with something gentler now. Gratitude, maybe? For the years they'd had. For the fact that loving someone new hadn't erased loving her. It had simply made more room, somehow, than he'd ever believed his own chest could hold. The years that followed weren't simple. Jonah wouldn't have believed anyone who promised him they'd be. The government's push toward full reservation confinement arrived, eventually, the way Takian had always known it would, no matter how many boundary lines got successfully defended along the way. Jonah stood beside Senna, through that too, helped negotiate terms that were still, in the end, far from fair, but better, at least, than they might have been, without someone who understood both worlds standing in the gap between them. They had a son. Named him for Takian, though everyone simply called him by his own name soon enough, the way names do. And Jonah kept writing. Filled that first leather journal, and then a second, and then a third, recording everything the elders would still let him record, stories, customs, the old boundary walked by feet instead of measured by any stake a surveyor had ever driven into the ground. Because somebody needed to remember. And he had, after all this time, finally found something worth staying alive long enough to finish. The porch in New Mexico caught the last of the afternoon light in a particular gold that Jonah had come to love best of any hour the day offered anymore. He was 76 now. His hands didn't hold steady the way they used to, and his knees complained about weather changes days before the weather itself arrived to confirm it. But his mind, most days, stayed clear enough. Clear enough, anyway, for this. His grandson Caleb sat across from him, 32 years old, restless in the particular way young men got restless, when they were carrying a decision they hadn't made peace with yet. "You've been quiet all afternoon," Jonah said. Caleb didn't answer right away. Looked out at the desert instead, like the answer might be easier to find out there than in his grandfather's patient face. "There's a company," Caleb said finally. "Mining outfit. Been asking about the old grazing parcel." "Your parcel, grandfather. The one that's still legally yours, from the original land grant." Jonah felt something old and familiar tighten in his chest. "What are they offering?" he asked. Careful. Keeping his voice even. "More money than I've seen in my whole life," Caleb admitted. "Enough to set myself up proper. Enough that saying no feels." He shook his head, frustrated with himself. "Feels like a decision I shouldn't even have to think this hard about making." "But you're thinking hard about it," Jonah said. "Because something about it doesn't sit right," Caleb said. "I can't put words to what, exactly. It feels like the kind of offer that sounds too easy for what it's actually asking me to give away." Jonah looked at his grandson a long moment. and felt, sitting there in the gold afternoon light, the strange weight of watching history lean forward to repeat itself in front of him, dressed up in new clothes, offering the same old bargain in a slightly different voice. "Let me tell you a story," Jonah said. "About a man who once wanted this exact same land. Different reasons. Same appetite. You've told me stories before," Caleb said. Gentle. Half a smile. "Not this one," Jonah said. "Not all of it. Pour me some water. This one takes a while." Caleb poured. Settled back into his chair, with the same patient attention he'd carried, since he was young enough to sit at his grandfather's feet instead of across from him as an equal. "It starts," Jonah said, "with 400 warriors surrounding a cabin I used to call home. And a woman who broke her own mother's travois on purpose, because she needed to know whether a stranger's kindness could be trusted." He touched his wrist, where 3 small stones, worn nearly smooth now by 36 years of constant wear, still caught the last of the afternoon light. "It's a long story," Jonah said. "But I think, given what's sitting in front of you right now, you'd better hear the whole of it." He told it slow. The dawn. The trials. The water given away instead of kept. And a man named Bishop, who had taken, from his family twice across 14 years, first with a soldier's bullet, then with a surveyor's stakes, before 4 people refused to let him take a third time. Caleb listened without interrupting, the sun sliding lower behind the desert ridgeline the whole while, until the story had caught all the way up to itself, up to this exact porch, this exact conversation, this exact decision waiting to be made. "So you're saying," Caleb said finally, "that the mining company is just another Bishop? Different suit?" "I'm saying," Jonah said, "that some offers cost more than the money they're dressed up in. And it's not always easy to see the true cost, until it's already been spent." He looked at his grandson steadily. "I'm not telling you what to decide, Caleb. That decision belongs to you. I'm only telling you to look harder at what's underneath the offer, before you sign anything away." Caleb was quiet a long while. "Grandmother Senna," he said eventually. "Did she ever regret it? Staying with you? Fighting all of that, instead of just living quieter?" Jonah smiled. Small. Genuine. "She used to say," he said, "that quiet living was only peace, if the ground underneath it was actually yours to keep quiet on. Otherwise it was just waiting. Dressed up to look like peace." His eyes went soft, remembering. "She was right about most things. That included." Caleb nodded slowly, something settling behind his eyes, that looked, to Jonah, very much like a decision finally arriving. "I think I know my answer," Caleb said. "Sleep on it anyway," Jonah said. "Good decisions can survive one more night of thinking. It's usually only the bad ones that can't." Caleb laughed, soft, and it warmed something old and tired in Jonah's chest to hear it. Jonah reached over, slow with age, and worked the leather cord free from his own wrist. Held it out. 3 stones, white and red and black, worn nearly featureless by 36 years, still carrying every ounce of the weight they'd carried, since a chief's hand first tied them there in a hidden canyon at the edge of a life Jonah almost hadn't survived to live. "Take these," he said. Caleb's eyes widened slightly. "Grandfather, I can't." "You can't," Jonah said. "You will. Not today, maybe. But someday, and someday comes faster than any of us planned for." He pressed them into his grandson's palm, closed the young man's fingers around them gently. "They don't make you brave. They don't make you honest. They're not magic, whatever the stories might make them sound like." "Then what are they?" Caleb asked, turning the stones over in his hand, feeling their worn, familiar weight settle against his skin for the first time. "A reminder," Jonah said, "that the hardest, truest choice is usually the one that costs you something to make. And that the cost is almost always worth paying, in the end. Even when it doesn't feel that way at the time." The sun dropped the last of its light behind the ridge, and the desert went the deep, quiet blue that Jonah had come to love best of all, after everything. After every trial, every loss, every impossible dawn that had somehow, against every odd, led him here. White for endurance, he said quietly, watching his grandson study the stones in the fading light. Red for wisdom, black for truth. He looked out at the land. The same land, in its way, that had once surrounded him, with 400 riders, and a judgment he hadn't been certain he'd survive. Whatever you decide about that mining offer, Jonah said, decide it holding all three. Not just the easy one. Caleb closed his hand around the stones. I will, he said. And somewhere in the deepening blue of that New Mexico evening, Jonah Ward, 76 years old, a bridge built slow and hard won across two worlds that had once seemed impossible to connect at all, allowed himself, finally, fully, to rest. The proving continued. It always would. As long as there remained people willing to choose the harder truth. To build instead of take. To stay, when staying cost something, and to leave, when leaving was the only honest thing left to do. This was Jonah Ward's legacy. Not the stones themselves, but everyone who ever learned, from holding them, what they had truly cost to earn.